Welcome to Soft History Stories. There is a mountain range in the eastern United States that many Americans believe they already know. They've driven through it on family trips, hiked its winding trails, admired the brilliant autumn colors, and watched the morning mist drift through its ancient valleys. It feels familiar, peaceful, and timeless. But the truth is, these mountains are far less understood than they seem. Beneath the landscape we think we know, beyond the folk songs, the travel guides, and the marked hiking trails, lies a very different story. A story carved in stone, literally carved in stone. Thousands of tons of it, shaped and moved and stacked by hands we cannot identify, by minds we cannot trace, by a civilization or civilizations that our official history refuses to acknowledge. Scattered across the ridges and creek beds and forested hillsides of the Appalachian chain, from the southern highlands of Alabama and Georgia all the way north, through the Carolinas and Virginia and Pennsylvania and into New England, there are structures, chambers built from massive slabs of carefully fitted rock, standing stones, arranged in deliberate alignments, walls that run for miles through wilderness that has never been farmed, cans stacked on mountain summits in patterns that track the movements of the sun and moon across the sky. Petroglyphs carved in scripts that archaeologists still argue about, and governments have quietly tried to ignore. None of this fits the story we were taught, the story where North America was essentially empty before European contact, the story where indigenous peoples were nomadic hunters who left no permanent structures, the story where civilization, real civilization, with astronomy and architecture and long-distance trade, only arrived when ships crossed the Atlantic. That story has cracks in it, and the Appalachians are full of those cracks. Tonight, we are going to walk into those mountains together. We are going to sit beside stone chambers that have stood for thousands of years and ask the questions that mainstream history has preferred not to ask. We are going to follow the ridgelines where walls of unknown origins stretch through the trees. We are going to stand in the centers of stone circles and feel the weight of a mystery that is older than Rome, older than classical Greece, possibly older than anything we were ever taught to associate with this continent. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Let's begin at the beginning, not with the stones themselves, but with the landscape that holds them. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest mountain ranges on Earth. Geologists estimate that the core of the range began forming somewhere around 480 million years ago, when the ancient continent of Laurentia collided with a string of volcanic islands. The mountains that resulted were once as tall as the Himalayas. Time wore them down. Erosion carved the ridges and valleys we see today, but the rock itself, that rock, is ancient beyond comprehension. The granite and quartzite and gneiss that you find in the Appalachian are some of the oldest exposed bedrock anywhere on the planet. This matters for the story we are about to tell, because the people who built structures in these mountains, whoever they were not working with soft materials. They were working with some of the hardest, most durable stone on Earth. Structures built from Appalachian granite do not decay. They do not dissolve. They sit in the forest, covered slowly by moss and leaf litter, and they wait. They have been waiting for a very long time. The Appalachian Range runs roughly 2,000 meters from northern Alabama to the Gaspé Peninsula, the Quebec. That is a corridor, a long north-south corridor of ridges and valleys and river systems that would have served thousands of years ago as a natural highway. A path that connected climates and ecosystems and resources. A path that people would have followed, and there is good evidence that people did follow it for a very long time. The oldest confirmed human presence in the eastern United States dates back at least 15,000 years. Sites like Meadowcraft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, which sits in a valley just west of the main Appalachian ridges, have yielded artifacts that push that date possibly back to 20,000 years or beyond. The Cactus Hill site in Virginia has produced evidence suggesting human occupation going back 16,000 to 20,000 years. The Topper site in South Carolina may push even further. These are not people who simply passed through. They settled. They adapted to the changing post-glacial landscape. They developed relationships with this specific terrain over generations spanning thousands of years. And at some point, some of them began to build. The question that drives the mystery we are exploring tonight is this: who built what and when? Because not all the stone structures in the Appalachian can be explained by the indigenous cultures we know about from the historical record. Not all of them fit the patterns of the woodland period mound builders, whose sophisticated earthwork traditions are well documented and well understood. Not all of them look like anything that colonial-era European settlers would have built. Some of them look like something else entirely, something older, something that connects in ways that still make researchers uncomfortable to traditions on the other side of the ocean. That is where the real mystery begins. Drive north from New York City for about 2 hours, and you will find yourself in a place called Mystery Hill. That is the popular name for it. The official name given by the family that has owned and operated the site as a tourist attraction since the 1950s is America's Stonehenge. The site is in North Salem, New Hampshire, in a wooded stretch of southern New England that most people pass through without stopping. If you do stop and walk the paths through the trees and look at what is actually there, you will be confronted with something that does not fit any easy explanation. There is a complex of stone chambers and walls and standing stones arranged across roughly 30 acres of hillside. The chambers are built from massive slabs of granite, fitted together without mortar. Some of the roofing stones weigh several tons. The interiors are large enough to stand in, large enough to sleep in, fitted with drainage channels cut into the stone floors. One chamber has what appears to be a carved speaking tube, a groove in the stone that channels sound from the interior to a point outside the entrance. A feature that would allow someone inside the chamber to speak to people outside without being seen. The standing stones are positioned around the perimeter of the site in an arrangement that multiple independent researchers have confirmed aligns with significant solar and lunar events. The winter solstice sunrise, the summer solstice sunset, the equinoxes, the southern moonrise and moonset at the lunar standstill. These are not coincidental alignments. To produce them by accident would require a level of random luck that strains credibility far past the breaking point. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal found in a hearth at the base of one of the structures produced a date of roughly 2,000 years before the present. Other organic material from the site has produced dates ranging from 1,000 to 4,000 years old. The site was in use for a very long time. The mainstream archaeological position on America's Stonehenge has shifted over the decades. For a long time, the official story was that the structures were simply root cellars built by colonial-era farmers to store vegetables and preserve food through harsh New England winters. This explanation has the virtue of requiring no revision of the official history. Colonial farmers existed. They did build root cellars. Case closed. Except the explanation falls apart when you actually look at the structures. The chambers at Mystery Hill are not positioned near any farmable land. They are on a rocky hillside with thin, difficult soil. No colonial farm records mention them. Their construction technique, massive stone slabs fitted together with carefully worked faces and no mortar, is not how colonial New Englanders built anything. The astronomical alignments serve no practical agricultural function, and the speaking tube in that one chamber has no rational purpose in a root cellar unless root cellar owners in 18th century New Hampshire were more architecturally creative than anyone has previously documented. So if not colonial root cellars, then what? Some researchers have argued for a Celtic origin. Ancient Celtic and pre-Celtic peoples in Ireland and Britain built stone chambers called dolmens and passage tombs that bear striking structural similarities to what you find at Mystery Hill. The stone fitting technique, the astronomical alignments, the use of chambers for ceremonial purposes rather than domestic storage. All of these match old-world megalithic traditions going back 3,000 to 5,000 years. The inscription stones found at the site add another layer to this puzzle. Several stones at Mystery Hill carry markings that were studied in the 1970s by Barry Fell, a Harvard marine biologist who became one of the most controversial figures in American carriage. Pre-Columbian studies. Fell argued that the markings at Mystery Hill and at dozens of other sites across New England and beyond were examples of Orgum, the ancient script used by Celtic peoples in Ireland and parts of Britain. He argued that Celtic traders and explorers had visited, and in some cases settled, the eastern coast of North America thousands of years before Columbus. The academic establishment rejected Fell's conclusions with a ferocity that went well beyond normal scholarly skepticism. His books were dismissed. His methodology was attacked. His professional reputation was questioned. The inscriptions at Mystery Hill were declared to be natural scratches in the rock, or marks, made by colonial plows, or anything other than intentional writing. But the inscriptions did not go away, and neither did the questions. To understand why the academic establishment reacted so strongly, you need to understand what was at stake. Not just in terms of rewriting history, though the rewriting would have been dramatic, but in terms of the political and cultural weight that the official narrative of American prehistory carries, the story that says North America was essentially uninhabited or inhabited only by small, nomadic, non-iterate cultures before European contact was never just a historical argument. It was a political one. It was used consciously or not to justify colonization. If the land was empty or nearly so, and if the people who did live here had built nothing permanent and left no lasting mark on the landscape, then the European claim to the continent was easier to make. The legal concept of terraneous, empty land, depended on indigenous peoples being understood as people who did not really possess the land in any way that European law was obligated to recognize. Acknowledging pre-Columbian civilizations that built in stone, that practiced astronomy, that maintained long-distance trade networks, that left permanent marks on the landscape, would complicate that narrative enormously. It would raise uncomfortable questions about what was destroyed, what was taken, what was erased. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented pattern in the history of American archaeology. Sites that challenge the official timeline have repeatedly been dismissed, minimized, or simply not funded for further study. Researchers who pursue these questions professionally have found their careers quietly limited. The institutional incentives point overwhelmingly toward maintaining the existing consensus, and the existing consensus has very deep roots in the same colonial project that it helps to justify. This does not mean that every claim about pre-Columbian contact or ancient megalithic civilization in North America is true. Some of those claims are poorly evidenced. Some are frankly nonsense. Some are entangled with racist pseudo-history that attributes indigenous achievements to imaginary white European visitors rather than acknowledging them as indigenous achievements in their own right. But it does mean that the reflexive dismissal of all evidence that challenges the official timeline needs to be examined critically. It does mean that the question of who built the stone structures in the Appalachian deserves a more serious and open-minded investigation than it has generally received. With that said, let us go deeper into the mountains. The Shenandoah Valley of Virginia is one of the most historically significant corridors in North America. Bounded on the east by the Blue Ridge Mountains and on the west by the Allegheny Ridge, the valley runs roughly 200 meters from north to south, from the Towac River near Harpers Ferry down to the headwaters of the James River near Roanoke. Hernando Dotto passed through the southern end of the valley in the 1540s. General Thomas Jackson marched his Confederate troops through it in the 1860s. It has been a highway for humans for a very long time. What most visitors to the Shenandoah do not know, because it is not in the travel guides or on the Park Service interpretive signs, is that the valley and the ridges flanking it contain dozens of stone structures that have never been satisfactorily explained. In the hills east of Luray, a small city in the middle of the valley, there are stone walls running through the forest that follow ridgelines for miles. They are built from locally available limestone and sandstone without mortar in a technique that geologists and archaeologists have confirmed is not consistent with colonial-era fence building. Colonial stone walls in Virginia were typically built from field stones, cleared from farmland, and they follow field boundaries and property lines. These walls follow terrain, hugging the ridge crests in ways that make no practical, agricultural sense. Some researchers who have studied these walls believe they were boundary markers, lines drawn in stone to delineate the extent of a territory or a sacred landscape. The walls in some places connect with cairns, piles of deliberately stacked stones positioned on high points along the ridges. The cairns are visible from each other. A person standing at one can see the next one down the ridgeline and the next one after that. They form a system of visible communication, a chain of landmarks strung across the high ground. Who built them? That question has no official answer. The structures are not attributed to any known culture in the archaeological literature of the region. They predate any European settlement in the area. They are simply there in the forest, quietly waiting for someone to ask the right questions. 40 mi to the south, in the hills near the town of Wesborough, there is a stone chamber that has been known to local residents for generations. It is built into a hillside, with a low entrance that forces anyone entering to bend low, and an interior space large enough for several people to sit comfortably. The roofing stones are massive, each one weighing several tons, fitted together with a precision that would have required significant engineering knowledge to achieve. The floor of the chamber is flat and level, which would have required deliberate preparation of the site before construction began. The chamber is oriented to the northeast. On the morning of the winter solstice, the first light of sunrise enters the chamber through its low entrance and travels across the floor, illuminating the back wall. This alignment is precise. It does not happen on any other day of the year. It happens on the solstice, and it requires that whoever built this chamber knew with considerable accuracy exactly where the sun would rise on the shortest day of the year. That knowledge is not something you stumble into. It is the product of systematic astronomical observation over multiple years, possibly multiple generations. It implies a settled people, or at least a people who returned to the same location year after year, who recorded their observations, who planned their construction accordingly. The Cherokee people, whose ancestral territory covered much of the southern Appalachians, have oral traditions that speak of beings who came before them in the mountains. The Nunhai, the immortal people who lived inside the mountains, in the high peaks and the ridges. The Unwitsti, the little people of the forest who sometimes helped travelers and sometimes led them astray. Traditions of ancient stone places, places of power, places where the world was thin and the other side was close. Cherokee oral tradition also speaks of a people called the Mooney-eyed people, a race described as small in stature, with pale skin, and eyes so sensitive to light that they could only function at night or in darkness, which is why the Cherokee called them Mooney. They were, according to the tradition, in the mountains before the Cherokee arrived. They built things in stone, and when the Cherokee came down from the north and pushed into the southern Appalachians, the Mooney people retreated or disappeared, going underground into the caves and tunnels of the mountains. The colonial-era naturalist John Leader, who traveled through the Carolina mountains in the 1670s, recorded stories from indigenous informants about ruined stone structures in the interior mountains, built by people who were gone before living memory. Governor John Sevier of Tennessee recorded in his memoirs a conversation with a Cherokee chief named Okonos-Stoa, who described ancient stone fortifications in the region around Hiawassee, Georgia, and attributed them to a people who came from across the sea. Okonos-Stoa told Sevier that the structures had been there since before the oldest stories of his people, which placed them beyond the reach of oral history, back into a time before the stone Cherokee had any memory. These traditions do not prove anything in the scientific sense. Oral tradition, no matter how ancient or carefully preserved, cannot substitute for physical evidence and rigorous dating. But oral tradition carries information. It carries the memory of things that happened. And when the oral traditions of multiple indigenous cultures, separated by hundreds of miles of mountains, all speak of a time before their own people, when other beings built in stone and lived in these mountains, That pattern of testimony deserves serious consideration. Let us move further south now, deeper into the old heart of the Appalachians, into the territory that spans northern Georgia and western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. This is the Southern Highlands, some of the most rugged and isolated terrain in the eastern United States. The ridges here are steep, and the valleys deep, and the forests dense enough that even today, even with satellite imaging and GPS, there are hollows and coves that almost no one visits. In those hollows and on those ridges, there are things that do not fit. The Judaculla Rock in Cohee, North Carolina, is a massive soapstone boulder, roughly 20 feet long, covered in petroglyphs. The carvings include geometric patterns, lines, spirals, circles, and what appear to be human and animal figures. Some of the figures have 7 fingers on each hand. The rock has been known to European settlers since at least the 18th century, but the carvings are far older than European settlement. Cherokee tradition associates the rock with Tsulu, a great slanted giant who is a hunter and lord of the animals. The name Judaculla is a corruption of this name. The carvings at Judaculla Rock include marks that researchers have compared to symbols found in ancient script systems from the Old World. Specifically, some of the geometric patterns bear resemblance to symbols found in Minoan writing systems from the Mediterranean, to marks on Bronze Age artifacts from Ireland, and to carved symbols found on megalithic monuments in Brittany and the Iberian Peninsula. This does not prove contact, but it is a curious convergence that has not been satisfactorily explained as coincidence. 100 miles to the southwest, in the mountains of northern Georgia, there is a site that is perhaps the most dramatic and least discussed megalithic mystery in the entire Appalachian region. The Fort Mountain site in Murray County, Georgia, consists of a stone wall running nearly 900 feet along the top of a ridge with 29 pit-like depressions in the hillside below it. The wall is made from dry-laid stone, carefully fitted together, reaching heights of up to 7 feet in places. It was built by people who knew what they were doing. The pits remain unexplained. They are roughly circular, about 20 feet across and 4 to 6 feet deep. They are too numerous and too regularly spaced to be accidental. Some researchers have proposed that they are the bases of wooden watchtowers. Others have suggested they are storage pits or ceremonial features. No excavation has ever definitively established what they are or when they were made. The Cherokee tradition connects Fort Mountain to a group of light-skinned people, sometimes said to have had Welsh or pre-Columbian Celtic origins, sometimes simply described as a people who lived in the mountains before the Cherokee arrived. The legend of the Welsh Prince Madoc, who supposedly sailed to North America in the late 12th or 13th century, and whose descendants eventually mingled with or were absorbed by indigenous populations, has been attached to Fort Mountain by generations of local tradition. It has also been dismissed by mainstream historians as wishful thinking. But the wall is real, the pits are real, and neither colonial farmers nor any known indigenous culture of the documented historical period has been convincingly identified as the builders. The stone chamber tradition of the northeastern Appalachians is particularly concentrated in a region covering southern New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Within this region, researchers have catalogued hundreds of stone chambers. Some estimates place the total number of chambers in New England alone at over 900. Most are tucked into hillsides, built with the same basic technique, massive stone slabs for walls and roof, carefully fitted without mortar, oriented along astronomical lines. The explanations offered by mainstream archaeology have evolved over time without quite settling on anything satisfying. The root cellar hypothesis, as we discussed in the context of Mystery Hill, fails to account for the astronomical orientations, the construction technique, or the locations of most chambers. They are not near farmable land, not near colonial-era habitation sites, not documented in any colonial property record as functioning agricultural structures. A competing explanation holds that the chambers were built by indigenous peoples during the late woodland period, roughly 500 to 1000 CE. This explanation has more going for it archaeologically. Woodland period peoples in the northeast did construct stone structures in some contexts, particularly as burial vaults and ceremonial spaces. Some chambers in New England have yielded radiocarbon dates consistent with this time frame. But this explanation also runs into difficulties. Many chambers, when dated, produce results that are significantly older than the woodland period, and the specific construction technique, the careful fitting of large stone slabs into chamber forms with intentional astronomical orientation, does not have clear parallels in the known archaeological record of woodland period cultures in the region. If woodland peoples built these chambers, they were doing something architecturally that we have not documented them doing anywhere else. Which brings us back to the possibility that some of these structures, perhaps not all of them, but some, were built by people who were here before the cultures we know from the historical and archaeological record. People who left behind stone as their signature and then disappeared from our accounting of the past. The Connecticut River Valley, which runs from northern Vermont south through Massachusetts to Long Island Sound, is one of the most artifact-rich archaeological zones in New England. It has been inhabited continuously for at least 12,000 years. The river itself, with its rich bottomlands and reliable fish runs, would have been an exceptional place to live throughout the post-glacial period, along the slopes and hilltops, overlooking the Connecticut River from Brattleboro in Vermont south to Northampton in Massachusetts. There is an unusual concentration of stone chambers and standing stones. Some of the chambers here are more elaborate than typical examples elsewhere in New England. One chamber near Putney, Vermont, has an interior that measures roughly 15 by 8 feet, with walls built from carefully selected flat stones laid in a herringbone pattern. The entrance is flanked by 2 standing stones, each about 4 feet tall, positioned precisely to channel the rising sun at the winter solstice into the chamber's complete interior. A researcher named Byron Dix, working in the 1970s and 1980s, surveyed stone structures throughout central and southern Vermont and documented what he called a systematic, astronomical calendar embedded in the landscape. He found that certain prominent hilltops, each marked with canes or standing stones, formed triangulation points that tracked the positions of the sun and moon across the horizon. Viewed from specific observation points, the structures on different hilltops appeared to mark the positions of the solstices, the equinoxes, and the cross-quarter days. The points midway between solstice and equinox that correspond to traditional Celtic seasonal celebrations like Imbolc, Beltane, Lughnasadh, and Samhain. This would imply a landscape-scale calendar system, not a single monument like Stonehenge, but a web of observation points and markers spread across dozens of square miles of Vermont hillside, a system that would have required significant coordinated labor to build and maintain a system that implies a society with enough organizational complexity and enough astronomical knowledge to conceive and execute a project of that scale. Dix's work was published in the Bulletin of the Early Sites Research Society and attracted considerable attention in alternative history circles. It was largely ignored by mainstream academic archaeologists. Whether that reflects a genuine methodological flaw in his analysis or the institutional dynamics we discussed earlier is a question that has not been fully resolved. Let us talk about Upton, Massachusetts, because Upton is one of those places where the mystery becomes concrete and undeniable in a way that is hard to dismiss. The Upton Stone Chamber sits in a wooded hillside in the town of Upton in Worcester County, Massachusetts. It is one of the best preserved and most dramatically constructed stone chambers in New England. The structure consists of a corbel chamber, a beehive-shaped interior space created by progressively overlapping stone courses nearly 12 feet in diameter and 11 feet high at the apex, connected to a long entrance passage roughly 14 feet in length. The total volume of stone in the structure is enormous. Some individual stones in the corbel dome weigh several tons and were fitted together with remarkable precision. The construction technique corbeling is not something that colonial farmers invented. It is an ancient technique found in megalithic structures across the Old World, most famously at New Grange in Ireland. which was built roughly 5,200 years ago. The corbel dome at Upton is structurally identical to the corbel dome at New Grange in its basic principles. Stone courses overlap inward, each course slightly further toward the center until the top closes. The weight of the overlapping stones holds the structure together without any need for mortar or keystone. This is not a technique you arrive at by accident. Building a corbel dome requires understanding the structural principles of compression and cantilever. It requires careful selection and shaping of stones. It requires a level of architectural knowledge that represents either independent invention of a complex technique or transmission of that technique from a tradition where it was already known. The winter solstice alignment at Upton is confirmed. On the morning of the winter solstice, sunlight enters the long entrance passage and illuminates the back wall of the corbelled chamber. This requires precise orientation. The chamber builders had to know the exact direction of the winter solstice sunrise and align their entrance passage accordingly, a task that requires both astronomical knowledge and engineering competence. The town of Upton has officially recognized the chamber as a point of historical interest and constructed a small park around it. The signage at the park describes the chamber as a colonial root cellar, possibly dating to the 1700s. There is no mention of the corbelling technique. There is no mention of the winter solstice alignment. There is no mention of the dozens of similar structures scattered across the neighboring townships. This is the pattern that recurs throughout the Appalachian megalithic mystery. Not active suppression necessarily, but a persistent institutional preference for the simplest and least disruptive explanation. Regardless of whether that explanation actually fits the evidence, the mountains of western Maryland and Pennsylvania offer their own chapter in this story. The Susquehanna River, which drains much of central Pennsylvania before entering the Chesapeake Bay, passes through a landscape of ridges and valleys that was heavily occupied during the prehistoric period. The cultural tradition known as the Susquehannock people, who were encountered by European explorers in the 17th century, were themselves relative newcomers to the region. They had arrived from the north sometime around 1550 CE. The people who preceded them in the Susquehanna Valley, stretching back thousands of years, are known to us primarily through the artifacts they left behind. Those artifacts include some surprising things. In the late 19th century, a physician and antiquarian named Daniel Garrison Britton published a collection of accounts of inscribed stones found along the Susquehanna and its tributaries. Some of these stones bore marks that Britton and later researchers following in his footsteps compared to Phoenician writing. Phoenicia was an ancient maritime civilization based on the eastern Mediterranean coast in roughly what is now Lebanon, that was known to have conducted long-distance trade voyages throughout the Mediterranean and possibly beyond. The idea of Phoenician contact with North America has been dismissed as thoroughly as any idea in the alternative history field. It sounds fantastical, but the dismissal has sometimes been more reflexive than reasoned. The Phoenicians were, by the historical record, extraordinarily capable seafarers who navigated by stars and currents across open ocean. There is documented evidence from ancient sources of Phoenician exploratory voyages around the coast of Africa. The argument that the Atlantic was an absolute barrier to pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the Americas has been weakened considerably by the confirmed evidence of Viking settlement in Newfoundland around 1000 CE, and by genetic evidence suggesting contact between South American peoples and Polynesian islanders several centuries before Columbus. Whether the marks on the Susquehanna stones are Phoenician script, some other ancient script, indigenous pictographs, or natural weathering marks, is a question that has not been resolved by disinterested scientific investigation. The stones have not been subjected to the kind of rigorous multidisciplinary analysis that would be appropriate given the potential significance of the question. Moving deeper into Pennsylvania, into the forested ridges of the central part of the state, there is a tradition of stories about stone structures that goes back to the earliest European settlement of the region. William Penn, in his letters describing Pennsylvania in the 1680s and 1690s, made passing references to native accounts of ancient stone structures in the interior mountains. Missionaries working among the Lepe people in the 18th century recorded traditions of a time before the Lepe arrived in the region, when other people described as more numerous and more permanently settled had built in stone in the hills. The Lepe oral tradition specifically speaks of a place called Oneata, a name that has been variously translated as the stone place or the place of stone walls. Oneata was described as a sacred location in the mountains, a place of power where the ancient ones had built their ceremonial structures and where the spirits of the ancestors remained. The location of Oneata was never precisely identified in the historical record, but traditional accounts placed it somewhere in the ridge and valley country of central Pennsylvania. In the 20th century, a handful of amateur archaeologists and history enthusiasts began systematically surveying the Pennsylvania ridges for stone structures. What they found was not the systematic, well-funded scientific investigation that such a question deserves, but it was suggestive. Stone walls running along ridge lines, cairns positioned on high points with clear sight lines to other cairns miles away, small chambers tucked into hillsides, built from local stone without mortar, the entrances oriented toward the rising sun at various points in the solar calendar. None of this has been published in mainstream archaeological journals. The researchers involved were amateurs without the institutional credentials that determine what gets taken seriously in the academic world. Their findings exist in local historical society publications, in self-published books, in online forums where the quality of evidence and reasoning varies wildly, and the signal is hard to separate from the noise. This is part of what makes the Appalachian megalithic mystery so frustrating to investigate seriously. The questions are legitimate, but the institutional gatekeeping of legitimate archaeology has effectively ceded the field to researchers whose methods and conclusions cannot always be trusted. The result is that the evidence gets tangled up with claims that are poorly supported or, frankly, fabricated, and the genuine mystery gets buried under layers of wishful thinking and outright misinformation. Let us talk about what is actually known with reasonable scientific confidence. It is known that humans have been present in the Appalachian region for at least 15,000 years. It is known that some of those human populations built in stone. The evidence for this is solid. Woodland period burial mounds in the Ohio Valley, which represent the western edge of the broader Appalachian cultural zone, frequently incorporate stone in their construction. The Adena and Hopewell cultures, which flourished in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys from roughly 500 BCE to 500 CE, were sophisticated societies with long-distance trade networks, astronomical knowledge, and the ability to organize large-scale construction projects. The Great Serpent Mound in Ohio is 1,348 feet long and traces the form of a serpent in the landscape. The Newark earthworks, also in Ohio, enclosed an area of 4 square miles with precisely engineered earthworks, including a perfect circle and a perfect octagon aligned to the lunar standstill. These are not the works of simple nomadic hunters. They are the works of a culture with engineering knowledge, an organizational capacity comparable to any early civilization in the Old World. What is less clearly known is whether the megalithic stone tradition of the Appalachian highlands was connected to the Adena Hopewell tradition, or represented something different, something potentially older, or something imported from across the Atlantic, or all of the above, in different places at different times. The honest answer to the question of who built the stone chambers of New England and the stone walls of the Shenandoah is that we do not know. The evidence that has been collected by various researchers over the past century is suggestive but not conclusive. The institutional framework of American archaeology has not prioritized the investigation of these structures in a way that would resolve the questions, and the political and cultural sensitivity of the questions themselves has made dispassionate, rigorous investigation difficult to conduct, and even more difficult to publish. What we can say is this: there were people here, many people, over many thousands of years. They were not simple or primitive. They built things. Some of what they built has survived. and the full story of what they built and why has not been told. There is a ridge in western North Carolina called Clingman's Dome. It is the highest point in the Great Smoky Mountains, 6,643 feet above sea level, straddling the Tennessee-North Carolina border. Today it has a concrete observation tower and a paved parking lot, and thousands of visitors every year. But on the slopes of Clingman's Dome and the neighboring peaks in the forests that the national park designation has kept clear of development, there are things that the tourist maps do not show. Cans on the ridge crests, stone alignments in the hollows, a chamber built into a south-facing slope on a subsidiary ridge, its entrance oriented toward the equinox sunrise. The Smoky Mountains are a particularly rich area for these structures because the extreme ruggedness of the terrain has protected them from both agricultural development and the casual vandalism that has destroyed many similar sites in more accessible areas. The density of forest cover means that aerial survey, the standard tool for identifying archaeological features across a landscape, is largely ineffective. The mountains are, in the literal sense, hiding their secrets. Cherokee people who were not removed during the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, the community known as the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, still live in the mountains around the Smokies. Their oral traditions speak of specific places in the high country, specific peaks and valleys and rock outcroppings that are sacred. Some of these places are described as having been sacred since time immemorial. Sacred long before the Cherokee themselves arrived in the mountains. Sacred because of the stone structures that existed there before any living memory could account for. The Eastern Band has not been particularly forthcoming with researchers about the locations of these sacred sites, for reasons that are entirely understandable. The history of indigenous sacred sites in North America being discovered by outsiders, studied, published about, and then disturbed or commercialized, or simply used as props in other people's theories, is a history of harm. The Cherokee have learned from experience to be cautious about sharing what they know with people who may not use that knowledge respectfully. This creates a genuine impasse in the investigation of the Appalachian megalithic tradition. Some of the most significant evidence is in the custody literally and culturally of indigenous communities who have reasons not to share it, and those reasons are legitimate. Which means that part of the story of these mountains will only be told if and when trust is built between indigenous knowledge holders and researchers who are genuinely committed to approaching that knowledge on its own terms. We need to talk about the walls, not the chamber walls which are part of enclosed structures, but the standalone walls, the long, low, mysterious walls that run through the forests of the John Appalachian for distances that defy any practical agricultural explanation. The most dramatic example is in New England, in a region of Connecticut and Massachusetts, where thousands of miles of stone walls crisscross the landscape. Some of these walls are colonial in origin. The colonial settlers of New England were prodigious wall builders, clearing their stony fields of glacially deposited boulders and piling those boulders into boundary fences that defined their property lines. Millions of tons of stone were moved this way, and the legacy of colonial wall building is woven into the New England landscape. But not all the walls are colonial. Researchers who have carefully studied the New England stone wall tradition, comparing wall construction techniques, stone selection, and positional relationships to historical property records, have identified a subset of walls that do not fit the colonial pattern. These walls use different construction methods. They incorporate stones that are significantly larger than colonial farmers typically moved. They follow landscape features, ridge crests and hilltops and valley contours rather than property lines, and in some cases, they connect to stone chambers and standing stones in ways that suggest they were part of an integrated landscape design rather than agricultural boundary markers. Robert Thorson, a geologist at the University of Connecticut, has written extensively about New England stone walls and argues that nearly all of them can be explained by colonial, agricultural activity. He is the most credible mainstream voice, arguing for the conservative explanation. His research is rigorous, and his geological expertise is genuine. But even Thorson acknowledges that some walls in New England resist the colonial explanation. He describes them as anomalous, and he is candid about the fact that more investigation is needed before firm conclusions can be drawn. In the southern Appalachian, the wall tradition takes a different form. The walls in the hills of Virginia, West Virginia, and the Carolinas are typically built from different materials than the glacially deposited granite of New England. They use locally quarried sandstone and limestone and quartzite, fitted together in techniques that vary from site to site. Some of these walls, particularly those in the eastern ridges of West Virginia and the adjacent mountains of Virginia, follow ridgel lines for distances of several miles, maintaining elevations that would have required substantial labor to access for construction. The most striking of these southern Appalachian wall systems is in a region of southeastern West Virginia that has been studied informally and without significant institutional support by a small community of local researchers for the past several decades. What they have found and documented with photographs and GPS coordinates and hand-drawn maps is a network of walls, cairns, and chamber-like structures that covers an area of roughly 50 square miles of forested ridgeland. The walls in this system range from a few hundred feet to several miles in length. They connect with each other at specific points. The cairns are positioned at these connection points and at high points that provide views of distant landmarks. The chambers are built at the bottoms of hollows below springs in positions that would have made them naturally cool year-round. The entire network, when mapped, appears to delineate a territorial boundary of some kind, a line drawn in stone across a landscape that has been largely unchanged by modern development. Nobody knows who drew this line. Nobody has successfully dated the structures. No one with the institutional resources to conduct a serious archaeological investigation has turned their attention to this particular stretch of West Virginia ridgeland. It sits there in the forest, its stones slowly settling, its mystery slowly deepening. There is a phenomenon in the Appalachian megalithic tradition that keeps appearing in accounts from researchers working in different parts of the mountains, often without awareness of each other's findings. It is the phenomenon of marked stones, not petroglyphs in the conventional sense, not pictorial carvings of animals or people or abstract designs, but specific symbols repeated across different sites, across distances of hundreds of miles in a pattern that is too consistent to be coincidental. The most common of these symbols is a form of cup mark, a circular depression ground into the surface of a large stone. Cup marks appear on stones at sites throughout the Appalachian and are one of the most widespread megalithic symbols in the world, appearing on stones in Scotland, Ireland, Brittany, Iberia, India, and many other regions. Their meaning is unknown, but their universality suggests that they served some function, symbolic or practical, that was widely understood across ancient cultures. More specific symbols also appear repeatedly in the Appalachian record. A symbol consisting of two vertical lines, crossed by a horizontal line, resembling a simplified letter H, appears on stones at sites in New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. This symbol has also been identified in ancient European inscriptions, including in the Ogham tradition that Barry fell associated with the New England stones. A spiral motif common at Irish megalithic sites, like New Grange and Nath, appears on stones in New England and in the southern Appalachian at Judaculla Rock, and at several smaller petroglyph sites in the North Carolina mountains. A trident or three-pronged symbol appears at multiple New England sites and has parallels in Bronze Age European contexts. None of this proves that the people who made these marks were in contact with Old World, megalithic cultures, ancient human minds confronting the same cognitive challenges of making meaning visible in stone might independently arrive at similar symbols. The cut mark may represent something as universal as the sun or water or a human eye, something that independent cultures across the world might express in similar visual language. But the convergence is striking, and it deserves investigation more rigorous than it has received. Let us go back to New Hampshire and spend some time in the White Mountains. the northern end of the Appalachian chain, where the mountains are highest, and the winters most severe, and the forests most ancient. The White Mountains are geologically and ecologically unusual. Above the tree line, which in the Whites occurs at roughly 4,000 feet, there are vast expanses of alpine tundra, windswept and barren, where Krumholtz trees grow twisted and low against the stone. The summit of Mount Washington at 6,288 feet is famous for some of the most extreme weather recorded anywhere on Earth outside of Antarctica. In April 1934, observers on the summit recorded a wind gust of 231 miles per hour. In this harsh alpine landscape, there are cairns, many cairns, some of them modern trail markers built by the Appalachian Mountain Club to guide hikers through the above tree-lined terrain where the path is not always obvious. But some of them are older, significantly older. The older cairns are larger, built from stones that required multiple people to lift, positioned in locations that make no sense as trail markers because they are not on trails. They are on subsidiary ridges away from the main peaks in positions that provide specific views of the surrounding mountains and valleys, and some of them are positioned to mark astronomical alignments that are consistent with the chamber and standing stone traditions elsewhere in the Appalachian. One cluster of cairns on a ridge in the Presidentials, the high ridge that includes several of the highest summits in the range, has been studied by a handful of researchers who believe it constitutes an astronomical observation site. From the central cairn of the cluster, specific cairns on neighboring ridges appear on the horizon, at points that mark the summer solstice sunrise, the winter solstice sunset, and the spring and fall equinox sunsets. The sightlines are too precise to be accidental. If this interpretation is correct, it means that someone at some point in the past climbed these exposed and brutal alpine ridges in all weathers and all seasons, placed these heavy stones in precisely calculated positions, and maintained a system for observing and recording the movements of the sun across the mountain horizons. That is an extraordinary commitment. It speaks of a culture that took astronomical observations seriously as a matter of communal importance worth significant labor and exposure to real physical danger. Who would do that? What kind of culture places enough value on knowing exactly where the sun rises on the winter solstice to send people into the alpine zone to build stone markers and maintain them? The answer in the Old World is cultures that built Stonehenge, that built New Grange, that built the great megalithic monuments of Brittany and Malta and the Canary Islands. Cultures in which the solar calendar was not merely a practical agricultural tool, but a sacred framework around which the entire social and spiritual life of the community was organized. The Appalachian evidence, taken in its entirety, suggests that a similar framework existed here. The acoustic properties of stone chambers have been studied at sites in Europe and at several sites in the Americas, and the findings are intriguing. At New Grange in Ireland, researchers have documented remarkable acoustic effects. The corbel chamber creates resonance patterns that amplify and modify sound in ways that would have made drumming and chanting inside the space an extraordinary sensory experience. Similar acoustic properties have been documented at megalithic sites in Malta and at various sites in Scotland and France. At the Upton Stone Chamber in Massachusetts, a researcher named Stephen Waller conducted acoustic measurements and found resonance patterns broadly similar to those documented at New Grange. The corbel chamber amplifies low-frequency sounds and creates a distinctive reverberant quality that would make any sound produced inside the space, whether voice or drum or flute, sound radically different from sounds produced in the open air. This is not a coincidental feature. The builders of these chambers had to have been aware of the acoustic effect, either because they experienced it in structures they had seen elsewhere, or because they discovered it through experimentation and then deliberately reproduced it. The acoustic properties are a function of the specific geometry of the corbel dome, the material properties of the stone, and the acoustic conditions of the earth surrounding the structure. Getting this right is not something that happens by accident. The implication is significant. These chambers were not simply tombs or storage facilities or shelters. They were intentionally constructed acoustic environments, places where specific kinds of sound, specific kinds of experience could be produced and maintained. That is the definition of a ceremonial space. A place built to facilitate a specific kind of encounter between human consciousness and the world beyond ordinary experience. In the context of what we know about the spiritual and ceremonial traditions of ancient cultures worldwide, this makes sense. Cultures around the world across enormous distances of time and space have discovered that specific acoustic environments, caves, stone chambers, circular spaces with particular, resonant properties can powerfully alter human states of consciousness. They facilitate the trance states that shamanic traditions called journeying, the altered awareness that is described in contemplative traditions across cultures, the sense of connection to something larger than the individual self that is at the core of virtually every religious tradition in human history. The stone chambers of the Appalachians were in this reading not just architectural achievements. They were technologies of consciousness, ways of creating in specific places in the landscape, conditions that allowed human minds to access experiences they could not access in ordinary contexts. Let us spend a moment with the question of water. An unusual number of the stone chambers and megalithic structures of the Appalachian are positioned near springs or in the upper reaches of small stream drainages. This is not simply a matter of practical convenience, though fresh water near a ceremonial site is certainly convenient. The positioning appears to be intentional in a way that goes beyond practicality. In many ancient spiritual traditions, springs are understood as places where the underworld, or the world of the ancestors or the realm of spirits, communicates with the surface world. The water that emerges from the earth at a spring comes from below, from darkness and depth, from a place that ordinary human beings cannot access. It is in symbolic terms a portal, a place where the worlds touch. The positioning of ceremonial structures near springs in the Appalachian fits this pattern. It suggests that the builders understood their chambers as places where ordinary and non-ordinary reality were close together, where the barrier between worlds was thin. The spring provided literal water, but also symbolic resonance, the underground sending its gift up through the earth to the surface, at the same place where humans had built a structure to facilitate their own journey between worlds. Similar symbolic associations between springs and ceremonial structures are documented throughout the Celtic world, throughout ancient Mesoamerica, throughout the sacred landscape traditions of many indigenous North American cultures. The convergence of water and stone in sacred sites is one of those patterns that appears across cultures and across oceans, with enough consistency to suggest that it reflects something deep in human experience. Something about how human minds perceive the relationship between the flowing, changeable quality of water and the permanent, unchanging quality of stone. The dating question is the hardest and the most consequential. If the stone chambers and walls and cans and standing stones of the Appalachians are relatively recent, say 1,000 to 2,000 years old, then they are within the range of well-documented, indigenous cultures of the northeastern United States, and do not necessarily imply anything unusual about cross-ocean contact or ancient civilizations. They would simply be evidence that woodland period cultures or cultures immediately preceding the historically known tribes built in stone more extensively than mainstream archaeology has acknowledged. That would be an interesting revision to the official story, but not a revolutionary one. If some of these structures are 3,000 to 5,000 years old, the picture becomes significantly more complicated. At that range, we are dealing with a time when the Old World megalithic tradition was at its height. The Great Passage tombs of Ireland, the stone circles of Britain, the alignments of Brittany, the temples of Malta, all were built in this window. The Bronze Age sailors of the Mediterranean were conducting long-distance voyages. The Phoenicians were establishing trade networks across the known world, and the ancestors of the cultures we know from the historical record in North America were presumably living their lives in ways we can only reconstruct through the material culture they left behind. A small number of radiocarbon dates from Appalachian megalithic sites fall in this range. The oldest confirmed dates from Mystery Hill are in the 2,000 to 4,000 year range. Some charcoal deposits associated with stones at Vermont sites have produced dates of 3,000 to 4,000 years before the present. These dates are isolated. They do not constitute a body of evidence that would satisfy a skeptical peer reviewer, but they are there, and they have not been refuted by counter-evidence. If some structures are older still, 5,000 to 10,000 years old, then we are in genuinely unknown territory. At that age range, we are dealing with the early Holocene period, when the continental ice sheet had only recently retreated, and the landscape of the eastern United States was being resettled by populations spreading north from refugia in the south. The idea of a megalithic tradition in the Appalachian at that early date would require a significant revision of our understanding of the cognitive and social complexity of early post-glacial populations in North America. No confirmed dates from Appalachian megalithic sites are that old, but the absence of such dates may reflect the absence of investigation more than the absence of evidence. The Cahokia Mounds, located near present-day St. Louis, Missouri, represent the peak expression of a pre-Columbian urban tradition in North America. At its height around 1100 CE, Cahokia was home to an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time, larger than contemporary London. The city was organized around Monk's Mound, a platform mound that is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Cahokia is not in the Appalachians, but it is connected to the Appalachian megalithic story in important ways. The culture that produced Cahokia, the Mississippian culture, maintained long-distance trade networks that reached into the Appalachian. Mississippian artifacts, including specific types of pottery and carved shell objects, have been found at sites throughout the southern Appalachian. The cultural influence of Cahokia's peak period was felt as far east as the Atlantic coast. What this means is that at least one period of significant cultural complexity, organization, and long-distance connectivity existed in the eastern half of North America well before European contact. The assumption that nothing comparable existed before Cahokia is not an established fact. It is a default position based on the limits of current archaeological knowledge. Cahokia itself collapsed around 1350 CE for reasons that are still debated. Climate change, resource depletion, political instability, epidemic disease, possibly some combination of all of these. The urban culture it represented did not survive into the period when European explorers arrived to write it down. If a culture as complex and extensive as Cahokia could exist and then largely disappear from the written record in the span of a few centuries, what other cultures might have existed and disappeared in the vastly longer span of pre-Columbian time? There is a site in central Pennsylvania that has never been properly published, never been formally excavated, and never been officially acknowledged by any state or federal agency. It is known to a small number of local researchers who have visited it over the past several decades. They describe it as the most elaborate stone complex they have seen in the Appalachian. The site consists of a series of interconnected chambers and walls built from local sandstone on the southeastern slopes of a ridge in the ridge and valley country of the central part of the state. The chambers vary in size from small single-person spaces to a large central chamber, roughly 20 across and 8 feet high at the apex of its corbelled roof. The chambers are connected by narrow passages, some requiring crawling to navigate. The overall layout, when mapped, resembles in some respects the cellular structure of the major megalithic tomb complexes of Ireland and Britain, specifically the Passage Tomb tradition represented by sites like Nath and Dar in the Boone Valley. The walls at the site extend from the chamber complex in 2 directions, running along the ridge crest for distances that have not been fully surveyed, but appear to extend at least several miles. Standing stones have been found at intervals along these walls, their heights ranging from 3 to 7 feet, their positions appearing to mark specific sightlines across the valley below. The researchers who know this site have chosen not to publicize its location. Their reasons are practical. Similar sites in more accessible locations have been damaged by visitors. whether through careless exploration, intentional vandalism, or the well-meaning but harmful habit of clearing moss and leaf litter from stone surfaces in order to photograph them. They believe that protecting the site from disturbance is more important than publicizing its existence. This is a dilemma that runs through the entire Appalachian megalithic story. The sites that are well known, like Mystery Hill and the Upton Chamber, have been subjected to decades of visitor traffic, some well-organized and responsible, much not. The sites that are unknown are protected by their obscurity. Finding the right balance between investigation and preservation is genuinely difficult, and the absence of institutional support for proper archaeological management of these sites makes the dilemma harder to resolve. In 2015, researchers using LAR technology, light detection and ranging, a remote sensing method that can penetrate forest canopy and produce detailed maps of the ground surface beneath it, surveyed a portion of the Appalachian Highlands in northern Vermont. What they found beneath the tree cover surprised even the researchers who were looking for something unusual. Beneath the trees, the ground surface was not the random chaotic terrain of a natural forest floor. It was organized. Walls and mounds and depressions were distributed across the surveyed area in patterns that suggested deliberate planning. The walls were not colonial boundary markers, the mounds were not natural glacial features, and the depressions showed the circular regularity of intentionally constructed features. The scale of what the LiDAR revealed was significant. The organized features covered an area of several square miles. This was not a single site. It was a landscape that had been comprehensively modified by human activity. The results were not published in a mainstream archaeological journal. They were presented at a regional historical society meeting and then circulated privately among the small community of researchers interested in Appalachian megalithic sites. The reasons for this decision were again a combination of practical and political. The researchers involved were not affiliated with major universities. Their methodology, while legitimate, had not been reviewed by a peer with the credentials to give it academic credibility, and the implications of their findings were significant enough that publishing prematurely, without the institutional backing to defend the conclusions, could easily result in the work being dismissed without serious engagement. LiDAR is at this moment transforming archaeology in other parts of the world. In Cambodia, LiDAR surveys have revealed that the city of Angkor was far larger and more complex than previously known, extending across an area of nearly 1,000 square km. In the jungles of Guatemala, LiDAR has revealed Maya cities that were invisible from the air because of forest cover. Cities that contained hundreds of thousands of structures across enormous areas, suggesting populations vastly larger than previously estimated. The same technology applied systematically to the Appalachian Highlands would most researchers familiar with the region believe produce similarly dramatic results. The stone structures that have been found through ground-level survey and anecdotal reporting almost certainly represent a fraction of what is actually there. The forest is full of things we have not yet seen. Let us talk about the Monk's Mound connection from a different angle. The pre-Columbian cultures of the eastern United States were not isolated from each other. They maintained long-distance trade networks that moved specific goods, including copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, and mica from the Appalachian Highlands, across distances of thousands of miles. We know this because we find these materials far from their geological sources at archaeological sites throughout the region. Mica, the transparent layered mineral that splits into thin sheets, is particularly associated with the Hopewell culture of the Ohio Valley, which flourished from roughly 100 BCE to 400 CE. Hopewell people used mica extensively in their ceremonial practices, cutting it into intricate shapes, birds, and hands, and geometric patterns, and depositing these mica objects in burial mounds, along with other rare and beautiful goods. The mica they used came primarily from the Appalachian Highlands, specifically from mines in western North Carolina and adjacent parts of Virginia and Georgia, where mica occurs in large deposits. in the ancient metamorphic rocks of the mountain core. This tells us something important. The Hopewell people who were in the Ohio Valley were in contact with whoever was extracting mica from the Appalachian highlands. They were receiving that mica through trade networks that required sustained human communication and exchange across hundreds of miles of terrain. The Appalachian highlands were not isolated from the broader cultural world of pre-Columbian, eastern North America. They were integrated into it. This integration raises the question of what else was moving along those trade networks. Ideas move along trade networks. Architectural knowledge moves along trade networks. Astronomical knowledge, calendar systems, ceremonial practices, all of these can travel with the goods and the people who carry them. The stone chamber tradition of the northeastern Appalachians, if it is connected to the broader, megalithic culture of the region, was not necessarily built in isolation from other cultural influences. It may have been part of a web of influence and exchange that was more complex and far-reaching than our current archaeological understanding acknowledges. It is worth taking a step back and asking a larger question. Why do cultures build in stone? Throughout human history, across every continent and every era, cultures that reach a certain level of social organization and spiritual sophistication have built permanent structures from stone. Not all of them, and not always. But the impulse to build in stone, to create structures that will last beyond the lifetime of any individual or generation, appears to be deeply embedded in human cultural practice. Stone structures serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They are practical shelters and storage spaces. They are territorial markers. They are demonstrations of social organization and collective capacity. They are astronomical observatories. They are ceremonial spaces. They are monuments to the dead and the ancestors. They are monuments to the dead and the ancestors. They are expressions of the human desire to leave a permanent mark on the landscape, to say in the most durable medium available that we were here. In the Old World, the megalithic tradition has been studied extensively. We know a great deal about when the great stone monuments of Europe and the Middle East were, how they were built. The study of European megaliths is a mature field, with a rich literature and a history of serious, scholarly investigation going back over a century. In North America, the same investigation has not happened, not because there are no structures to investigate. We have seen that there are, but because the official narrative of American prehistory, with its assumption of essentially nomadic, non-literate, non-urban, non-monumental pre-Columbian cultures, has made the investigation of megalithic traditions in North America seem not just difficult, but almost incoherent. The question, who built the stone chambers of New England, has not been seriously asked by institutional archaeology, because institutional archaeology's default assumption is that no one did, that the chambers are colonial, or natural, or simply misidentified. This is, to put it gently, an extraordinary situation. Hundreds of stone structures of unclear age and origin, scattered across a mountain range that has been inhabited for at least 15,000 years, in a country that considers itself scientifically sophisticated, and the official answer to the question of their origin is essentially a shrug. The structures are anomalous. The investigation has not happened. Move along. The Gungywamp Complex in Groton, Connecticut, is one of the most extensively documented megalithic sites in New England. The site was formally studied in the 1980s by the American Institute of Archaeological Research under the direction of David Barron, and a detailed report was published. This makes Gungywamp unusual in the Appalachian megalithic tradition, where serious formal study is uncommon. The Gungywamp site contains multiple stone chambers, rows of standing stones, stone walls, and a series of features that Barron's team documented with admirable care. The standing stone rows are of particular interest. Two parallel rows of large stones run for approximately 50 feet, creating a corridor that is aligned to the equinox sunrise. On the mornings of the spring and fall equinoxes, sunlight travels down this corridor and strikes the entrance of one of the site's chambers. The chambers at Gungywamp include a double chamber, two corbelled spaces connected by a narrow passage that is unique in the New England stone chamber record. The construction technique is sophisticated. The corbelling is precise. The stones are carefully selected and fitted. Radiocarbon dates from Gungywamp produced a range of results with the most reliable dates, clustering in the period from roughly 500 BCE to 500 CE, the same general period as the Hopewell tradition in the Ohio Valley. This is interesting. It means that the Gungywamp Complex was in use during a period when trade networks connected the Appalachian Highlands to the Ohio Valley, when mica from the Appalachian was moving west and trade goods were moving east, when a level of cultural sophistication and long-distance connectivity existed in the region that makes the construction of astronomical ceremonial spaces entirely plausible. Barron's report was published and then largely ignored by mainstream American archaeology. The site has been managed by a local historical preservation organization since the 1980s. It is open to visitors, and the fundamental questions about who built it and why have not been answered. There is a theory advanced by a small number of researchers who work at the intersection of genetics, linguistics, and archaeology that the stone chamber tradition of New England and the northern Appalachians represents the legacy of a specific cultural migration that occurred sometime between 2,000 and 4,000 years ago. The theory proposes that a small population of people, possibly from the Atlantic fringe of Europe, where megalithic traditions were established and well developed, made the crossing to North America during the Late Bronze Age or Early Iron Age and settled in the northeastern coast. These immigrants would have been culturally integrated into existing indigenous populations over time, their distinctive architectural and ceremonial practices gradually fading but not completely disappearing. The evidence cited for this theory includes the architectural similarities between New England chambers and Irish passage tombs, the possible Ogham inscriptions at Mystery Hill and elsewhere, the astronomical orientation patterns that match Old World traditions, and certain genetic markers found in some northeastern indigenous populations that have tentatively been connected to Atlantic European ancestry. This theory is speculative. The evidence is fragmentary. The genetic connections are contested. The linguistic comparisons are methodologically disputed, and the theory exists in an uncomfortable space between mainstream scholarship and the alternative history world, which has enthusiastically adopted it as evidence of whatever specific pre-Columbian contact story each faction of that world prefers. But it is not impossible. Viking settlement in North America is now confirmed. Polynesian South American contact is now confirmed. The Atlantic Ocean was not an absolute barrier to pre-Columbian contact. The question of whether Celtic or Proto-Celtic peoples from the eastern Atlantic fringe made the crossing is an empirical question, not a theoretical impossibility. It deserves the kind of serious, rigorous, well-funded investigation that has never been applied to it. The mountains breathe differently at night. If you have ever camped in the Appalachian, not in a campground with electric hookups and a camp store, but deep in the back country, on a high ridge or in a remote hollow, you know what I mean. The daytime sounds, the birds and the insects and the wind through leaves fade into a different kind of soundscape after dark. The temperature drops, the stars come out, and up here, away from the light pollution of the valleys, they come out brilliantly, the Milky Way visible as a river of light across the sky. In that darkness and that silence, surrounded by old stone and older forest, it is not difficult to feel the presence of the past, not as a ghostly or supernatural thing, but as a simple fact. These mountains have been inhabited for thousands of years. The people who were here before us were fully human, fully conscious, fully alive in the way that you and I are alive. They stood in these same hollows under these same stars. They built things that lasted, and some of those things are still here, waiting in the darkness and the leaf litter and the slow processes of the forest to be found. The mystery of the Appalachian megalithic tradition is not merely an intellectual puzzle, though it is certainly that. It is also an invitation to take seriously a longer human story than the one we are typically taught. A story that does not begin with European contact, or even with the documented indigenous cultures of the colonial era, but reaches back thousands of years into a past that we are only beginning to understand. Let us turn our attention to one of the most puzzling categories of Appalachian stone structures, the perched boulders. Throughout the Appalachian Range, there are large boulders, some weighing many tons, balanced on other stones in ways that appear deliberately arranged rather than naturally occurring. These balance rocks, or Logan stones as they are sometimes called, share certain characteristics. They are positioned on high points, often on ridges or summits. They can be rocked back and forth by a relatively small application of force to a specific point, suggesting that they were deliberately balanced in a position of precarious stability. And they are found in clusters near other stone structures, rather than in random distribution across the landscape. Natural geological processes can produce balanced rocks. Differential weathering, glacial deposition, and frost action can all leave large rocks perched in unlikely positions. Not every balanced rock in the Appalachians is human-made, but some of them, the researchers who study this tradition believe, are deliberately placed. They point to the consistent positioning on high ground, the relationship to other stone features in the landscape, and the specific way in which the balance point is chosen. A naturally balanced rock sits in whatever stable position it ends up in after whatever geological process deposited it. A deliberately balanced rock is positioned at the point of minimum stability so that it can be rocked, so that it responds to human touch in a way that a naturally balanced rock would not. Why would anyone go to the trouble of balancing a large rock on another rock? The most compelling answer again connects to ceremonial and astronomical traditions. In Celtic traditions, certain stones were believed to be oracles, sources of divine communication. Rocks that moved or rocked were particularly associated with truth-telling and judgment. The medieval Irish tradition of the leaf fail, the stone of destiny, which was said to cry out when the rightful king stood upon it, reflects a broader cultural tradition in which certain stones responded to human touch in ways that carried sacred significance. A rocking stone, one that moves when a human hand pushes it, but remains in place otherwise, would too have profound symbolic resonance in a tradition that understands stones as living or spiritually active. It demonstrates a kind of responsiveness, a kind of aliveness, in a material that might otherwise seem inert. This is speculative. The connection between Appalachian perch boulders and Celtic sacred stone traditions is not established by direct evidence, but it is a plausible interpretive framework for a feature that otherwise has no satisfying explanation. The research tradition of the Early Sites Research Society, founded in 1969 by James Witt and others, represents the most sustained and systematic effort to document Appalachian and New England megalithic sites within an organized framework. The Society published the Bulletin of the Early Sites Research Society for several decades, accumulating a body of site reports, dating studies, and interpretive essays that remains the most comprehensive reference in the field. The quality of work published in the Bulletin is uneven. Some reports are careful and methodologically rigorous. Others reflect the enthusiasm of amateurs who brought more passion than analytical discipline to their investigations. The Society operated at the margins of mainstream archaeology, never achieving the institutional recognition that would have given its findings credibility in academic circles. But the body of documentation it produced is significant. The Bulletin records visits to hundreds of sites, measurements of hundreds of structures, observations of hundreds of astronomical alignments. Even if not all of these records meet the standards of peer-reviewed archaeology, they constitute a database that serious investigators can use as a starting point. The challenge for anyone who wants to approach the Appalachian megalithic tradition seriously today is separating the legitimate evidence from the overlay of speculation, wishful thinking, and outright fabrication that has accumulated around it over the decades. This is genuinely difficult. The serious and the fraudulent are often entangled in the same publications, the same websites, the same local traditions. Sorting them out requires patience, critical thinking, and a willingness to hold uncertainty without resolving it prematurely in either direction. There is something worth saying about the emotional experience of encountering these sites. Most of the researchers who have devoted significant portions of their lives to investigating the Appalachian megalithic tradition, amateur and professional alike, describe a quality of experience at these sites that goes beyond intellectual curiosity. They describe a sense of weight, of presence, of being in a place that was important to someone, that was built with care and intention. Kais retained something of that intention across the centuries or millennia of its existence. This is not evidence of anything supernatural. Humans are profoundly responsive to built environments. We respond to scale, to craftsmanship, to the sense that a place was designed and constructed rather than randomly occurring. We respond to age, to the awareness that we are in the presence of something made by hands that have been dust for a very long time. We respond to the qualities of light and sound and smell that stone environments produce, qualities that are different from open air and different from wooden structures. These responses are real. They are documented in the psychological literature on environmental experience. The experience of being in a stone chamber at dawn, when the winter solstice sunlight enters through the narrow entrance and moves slowly across the floor, is genuinely powerful. Regardless of what one believes about who built the chamber or why, that experience multiplied across hundreds of sites, scattered through thousands of miles of mountain landscape, adds up to something, a cumulative testimony to the human need for sacred space, for marked landscape, for the sense that the territory one inhabits is not merely physical, but also meaningful. The Appalachian megalithic builders, whoever they were expressing something deeply and universally human, and the mountains have held that expression for a very long time. The geography of the Appalachian chain divides the eastern United States into distinct ecological zones. The mountains themselves, running north to south, form a barrier that separates the Atlantic coastal plain from the interior valleys and plateaus. This barrier has shaped human movement and cultural development in the region for thousands of years. The passes through the Appalachian, the gaps and valleys that allow relatively easy transit from east to west, were strategic resources. The Cumberland Gap in the mountains where Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee meet was the gateway through which most early American westward migration moved. Before the European settlement period, those same gaps were transit points for indigenous trade networks and cultural exchange. The stone structures we have been discussing are not randomly distributed across the Appalachian. They cluster in certain areas, particularly in the northern mountains, in the southern highlands, and in the ridge and valley country of the central states. They also appear less densely, but still significantly near the major gaps and passes. This distribution pattern suggests that the builders were aware of and oriented toward the geography of movement through the mountains. Structures near gaps could have served as waypoints for travelers, as territorial markers for groups that controlled access to specific passes, or as ceremonial locations where travelers paused to observe proper protocols before entering new territory. In many indigenous North American traditions, travel through unfamiliar or sacred territory requires specific ritual acknowledgement, a recognition of the spiritual significance of the landscape being entered. The stone structures near Appalachian passes may have served among other functions as locations where these acknowledgments were made, where offerings were left, where prayers were spoken, where the transition from one territorial zone to another was marked in the appropriate way. The Cherokee removal of the 1830s, known as the Trail of Tears, resulted in the forced relocation of the vast majority of the Cherokee people from their ancestral territory in the southern Appalachians to Indian territory in what is now Oklahoma. Along with the people, a great deal of knowledge about the sacred landscape of the southern Appalachians was also removed, or rather was carried away to a place where it could no longer be easily applied to the mountains it described. The knowledge did not disappear entirely. The eastern band of Cherokee, who remained in the mountains after the removal, retained much of the traditional ecological and sacred knowledge of their people, and the descendants of the removed Cherokee in Oklahoma have maintained oral traditions about the homeland mountains that have survived in that form for nearly 2 centuries of diaspora. When researchers have engaged respectfully with Cherokee traditional knowledge holders, either from the Eastern Band or from the Western communities, they have sometimes received information about specific places in the southern Appalachian that correlates with the stone structure record. Places described in traditional accounts as ancient, as powerful, as sacred, in ways that predate even Cherokee occupation of the region, have sometimes turned out upon investigation to be places where stone structures exist. This convergence between indigenous traditional knowledge and the archaeological record is significant. It suggests that the stone structures were not simply forgotten, but were remembered in the form of place names and sacred geography narratives by the cultures that came after the builders. The memory of their importance persisted even when the specific knowledge of who built them was lost. Let us consider what it would mean to know the full story. Imagine that we had the evidence. Imagine that rigorous, well-funded, multidisciplinary investigation of the Appalachian stone structures had been ongoing for the past 50 years, producing a body of reliable data on the ages, construction techniques, astronomical orientations, and cultural contexts of these structures. Imagine that we knew with reasonable confidence who built them, when, and why. What would that story look like? One possibility is that the story is essentially indigenous, that the stone chambers and walls and cairns of the Appalachian were built by the ancestors of known indigenous cultures, perhaps stretching back further in time and representing more complexity and permanence than mainstream archaeology has acknowledged. That would be a significant revision of the official history, and it would require a reckoning with the ways in which that official history has underestimated and undervalued indigenous cultural achievement. But it would not require invoking transatlantic contact or ancient civilizations that left no other trace. A second possibility is that the story involves multiple cultural inputs, that some structures are indigenous in origin, representing local developments of ceremonial architecture, while others reflect Old World influence, brought by contacts whose nature and timing we cannot yet specify. This possibility is more disruptive to the official narrative, but is not ruled out by any conclusive evidence we currently have. A third possibility is more radical, that the stone structure tradition of the Appalachians represents the remains of a cultural development in North America that preceded the historically known cultures by a significant margin, a civilization or proto-civilization that flourished and then declined, or was disrupted before the period from which we have the first reliable records. A lost chapter in the human story on this continent. The honest answer is that we do not have enough evidence to confidently choose among these possibilities. The investigation that would produce that evidence has not been conducted, and until it is, the mystery remains. There is a man named Norman Mueller, a conservator at the Princeton University Art Museum, who has spent decades of his personal time investigating stone structures in the New England and Mid-Atlantic states. He is not an archaeologist by training or credential. He is an art conservator who became obsessed with a question that the archaeological establishment had declined to pursue. Mueller has published careful documentation of specific sites with measurements and photographs and comparisons to Old World parallels. He has engaged seriously with the question of construction technique, studying how the stones were selected, prepared, and placed. He has been respectful of the possibility that many structures have indigenous origins, while remaining open to the possibility that some structures reflect influences that mainstream archaeology has not acknowledged. His work is not definitive. It cannot be because the tools and institutional resources that would allow definitiveness have not been brought to bear on the question, but it is careful, honest, and genuinely informative. It represents the kind of intellectual engagement with a difficult and politically charged question that the question deserves. Mueller's experience is representative of the small community of researchers who have devoted significant personal resources, time and money, and professional reputation to investigating the Appalachian megalithic tradition. They are motivated by genuine curiosity and a conviction that the evidence warrants serious, attention. They operate without institutional support, without funding, without the validation of peer review, and they have produced a body of work that is imperfect but real. If this tradition of research is eventually vindicated by more rigorous investigation, the story of how it was conducted, the passion and the frustration, and the years of wandering through forest with GPS units and notebooks and cameras will be worth telling on its own terms. The night is deep now. The mountains are quiet in the way that only old mountains get quiet. A silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of great stillness. The wind has died. The creak that you could hear from the camp has faded to a murmur. The fire has burned low. Somewhere out there in the darkness, the stones are waiting. The chamber with its precisely fitted roofing slabs, the walls that run along the ridge crest into the trees, the standing stones whose shadows move as the moon crosses the sky. They have been waiting for a very long time. They will wait longer, but they are there. However, the mystery of their origin is eventually resolved. Whatever combination of indigenous achievement and long-distance contact and lost, knowledge and institutional neglect explains why they exist and why we do not understand them. The stones themselves are undeniable. They were placed by human hands, shaped or selected by human intelligence, positioned with human intention in a landscape that those humans understood as sacred and significant. That is a fact. Whatever else is uncertain, that is a fact. Let us talk about copper. The Great Lakes copper tradition is one of the oldest and most extensive metalwork traditions in the world. Native copper. Copper that occurs naturally in nearly pure metallic form rather than as ore, requiring smelting, is found in enormous deposits along the south shore of Lake Superior, particularly on the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan. The copper found in these deposits is exceptional in its purity and workability. Indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region were working this copper into tools and ornaments at least 5,000 years ago, and possibly as early as 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. The Old Copper Complex, as archaeologists call this tradition, produced copper tools, including spear points, knives, axes, and fish hooks that were traded across enormous distances. Copper objects from Lake Superior have been found at archaeological sites along the Atlantic coast, in the Mississippi Valley, in the Ohio Valley, and throughout the broader Appalachian trade zone. The scale of copper extraction from the Lake Superior deposits is staggering. Estimates based on the volume of prehistoric mine pits in the Keweenaw region suggest that ancient miners extracted somewhere between 500 million and 1.5 billion pounds of copper from the deposits over the course of the mining tradition. This is an extraordinary amount of metal. The copper objects found at known archaeological sites throughout North America account for only a tiny fraction of that extracted copper. Where did the rest go? This is the question that has haunted researchers of the North American copper tradition for over a century. Some of the copper may have corroded and been lost, but the sheer discrepancy between the estimated amount extracted and the amount accounted for in the archaeological record has led some researchers to propose that significant quantities of Lake Superior copper were exported, possibly across the Atlantic, during the period when the copper trade was most active. This proposal is not widely accepted. It relies on establishing a trade connection between North America and Old World markets, for that which there is currently no direct archaeological evidence. Specifically, no Lake Superior copper identified in Old World sites from the Bronze Age. But it is not an impossible idea. The Bronze Age of Europe required enormous quantities of copper to produce the metal that defined the age. The known Old World sources of copper, particularly in Cyprus and the Iberian Peninsula, have been questioned by some researchers as insufficient to account for the scale of Bronze Age metal production. If transatlantic trade in copper occurred, it would potentially explain two mysteries at once. What does this have to do with the Appalachian megalithic tradition? The connection is through the trade networks. The same corridors that moved Lake Superior copper east through the Great Lakes and along the two rivers that drain into the Ohio and eventually to the Appalachian Highlands would have moved other things as well. People, ideas, architectural knowledge, astronomical traditions, The stone chamber builders of New England, if they were using long-distance trade routes that connected the Appalachian to the Great Lakes, and through those lakes to points beyond, were embedded in a network of cultural exchange that was more extensive than our current understanding reflects. The number of undocumented sites in the Appalachians is by definition unknown, but the density of documented sites in surveyed areas suggests that the total number of stone structures in the mountains, if a comprehensive survey were ever conducted, would be in the thousands. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of stone structures built by human hands, scattered across a mountain range that runs 2,000 meters through the eastern United States. The vast majority of them, unknown to official archaeology, unstudied, undated, their builders unidentified. This is not a small mystery. This is one of the largest unresolved questions in American prehistoric archaeology, and it has been allowed to remain unresolved. Not because the tools to investigate it are unavailable, not because the intellectual frameworks for making sense of it do not exist, but because the institutional will to take the question seriously has never been mustered. The question of why that institutional will has been absent is worth sitting with. It connects to the larger issues of colonial history and the politics of knowledge that we touched on earlier. It connects to the way that academic disciplines define their boundaries and defend their consensuses. It connects to the chronic underfunding of American archaeology compared to the scale of what needs to be investigated, and it connects to a cultural habit of thinking about North America as a place where significant things only started happening recently, a habit so deeply ingrained that even asking about pre-Columbian complexity feels transgressive. The stones in the mountains do not care about any of this. They were there before the academic disciplines were founded. They will be there after current controversies are forgotten. They hold their mystery with extraordinary patience. The Mississippian culture's influence on the Appalachian highlands in the centuries before European contact is documented most clearly in the ceramic and material culture record. Mississippian-style pottery, with its distinctive shell-tempered construction and incised, decorative motifs, has been found at sites throughout the southern Appalachians. Mississippian prestige goods, shell gorgets, and copper plates, and ceramic effigies appear at sites in the mountain zone that were otherwise occupied by local cultures, maintaining their own traditions. This pattern of Mississippian influence, reaching into the mountains without fully replacing local traditions, is consistent with what anthropologists call a peer-polity interaction sphere, a system in which distinct regional cultures maintain their own identities while exchanging goods, ideas, and prestige items with neighboring complex societies. The mountains communities were not provinces of Cahokia. They were independent entities that participated in the broader Mississippian exchange system on their own terms. What this suggests is that the people living in the Appalachian highlands in the centuries before European contact were not culturally isolated. They were participants in a larger cultural world that included the major urban centers of the Mississippi Valley and the complex chiefdoms of the coastal plain. They had access to ideas and innovations that circulated through that broader world. If the stone structure tradition of the Appalachians was still active during this period, which the available dates suggest it was in some areas, then it was not a relic of a forgotten past, but a living tradition practiced by people who were also participating in the broader cultural world of pre-Columbian eastern North America. That picture is significantly more complex and interesting than the image of isolated, mountain peoples that has sometimes been invoked to explain away the stone structures. Let me tell you about a specific experience that a researcher named James Rankin had on a hillside in Vermont in the autumn of 1983. Rankin was not a credentialed archaeologist. He was a school teacher who had become interested in stone structures after reading Barry Fell books and deciding to look for himself. He had been walking the hills of central Vermont for several years, documenting what he found with a notebook and a camera. On an October morning in the last warmth before winter, he climbed a particular hill that he had been told by a local farmer contained some old stone walls. He found the walls as expected, and he found something he had not expected. At the crest of the hill, where the forest opened onto a small rocky summit, there was a chamber low built into the hillside, its entrance facing east. It was smaller than the Upton Chamber, smaller than the Gungywamp chambers, but built with the same general technique. The roofing stones were massive, the interior was finished and dry, the floor had been leveled. He entered the chamber and sat for a while in the dark, and then he noticed the light. A thin beam of sunlight was entering through a crack between two roofing stones, a gap so narrow that in ordinary conditions it would admit no light at all. But on this particular morning, in mid-October, the sun was at an angle that sent its light directly through that crack and cast a moving line of brightness across the chamber floor. Rankin sat and watched as the light moved, and he realized eventually that it was pointing at a specific stone embedded in the back wall of the chamber, a stone that was slightly different in color from the surrounding stones, a stone that, when he looked at it more carefully, bore marks, not dramatic petroglyphs, not clearly letters or images, but deliberate marks nonetheless, gouged into the stone surface with a controlled hand. He photographed the marks. He published his account and the photographs in the Bulletin of the Early Sites Research Society. He submitted the photographs to researchers who study ancient scripts. The interpretations he received varied. Some saw ogham, some saw meaningless scratches, some saw a calendar notation. No consensus emerged. Rankin returned to that hill every October for the next dozen years, checking whether the light phenomenon repeated on the same date. It did consistently in the third week of October. The beam of light appeared and tracked across the chamber floor to the marked stone. The third week of October corresponds approximately to the cross-quarter day between the fall equinox and the winter solstice, a date that falls on, or near, October 31 in the modern calendar, a date that the Celtic tradition knows as Samhain, the festival that has survived in the popular imagination as Halloween. Whether the chamber was built to mark Sin in a Celtic ceremonial calendar, or to mark an equivalent date in some other calendar system, or whether the coincidence is less meaningful than it appears, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. But the phenomenon is real. The light enters on that date. The mark is there. And someone at some point in the past built this chamber in this exact position, oriented this entrance in this exact direction, and placed this particular stone in this particular spot in the back wall. That was not accidental. The rivers of the Appalachian region drain in two directions. The rivers that rise on the eastern slopes flow to the Atlantic. The rivers that rise on the western slopes flow to the Ohio, and then the Mississippi and, ultimately, to the Gulf of Mexico. This hydrological divide which follows the main Appalachian Ridge is one of the most significant geographical features of eastern North America. The rivers that drain east, the James and the Potomac, and the Susquehanna and the Connecticut and the Susquehanna, and dozens of others, were the highways of contact between the Appalachian highlands and the Atlantic coast. They provided canoe routes into and through the mountains. They connected the inland stone structure zone with the coastal world. The coastal world had its own connections. The Atlantic coast of North America, from the Gulf of Mexico to Labrador, was inhabited by coastal peoples who were skilled mariners, who knew the currents and winds and tidal patterns of the ocean, who maintained contact with other coastal communities over long distances, and the Atlantic coast is the closest point of North America to Europe. The shortest crossing from the Azores to Newfoundland is roughly 2,000 miles, a formidable distance, but not an impossible one for Bronze Age maritime cultures that were already conducting open ocean voyages throughout the Mediterranean and possibly around the Azores coast of Africa. The rivers that drain west from the Appalachians connected the mountain zone to the great trade networks of the Mississippi Valley. They provided routes along which goods and ideas and people moved between the highlands and the land cultural centers. The Appalachian highlands were not a backwater. They were a crossroads sitting between the Atlantic contact zone and the interior exchange. Networks receiving influences from both directions. If you want to understand why the Appalachian stone structure tradition has the character it has, diverse, widespread, stylistically varied, but recognizably related across long distances. This geographical position is the key. The mountains were not isolated. They were at the center of a web of connections. We have been in the mountains for a long time now, walking the ridges and sitting in the chambers and studying the walls that run through the dark forest. The fire, metaphorically speaking, has burned low. The stars are fully out. The Milky Way crosses the sky in the way it crosses every sky, the same as it crossed the sky over these same mountains 10,000 years ago. Somewhere out there in the darkness, perhaps a few miles away, or perhaps much closer, there is a stone that was placed by a human hand in a time before memory. It has been in the same position through all the intervening centuries, through the growth and death of uncounted forests, through all the changes in the human world above and around it. It has been rained on and snowed on and breathed on by generations of sleeping bears in winter, wet dens. It has listened to the wind in the trees and the water in the creeks, and the distant sound of the world going about its business. It does not know that we are looking for it, but it is there. The question of what we owe to this mystery is worth considering. We owe it serious investigation. The evidence that exists deserves rigorous study by researchers with the tools and credentials to do it properly. The LAR technology that revealed the extent of Anchor and the Maya cities should be applied systematically to the Appalachian highlands. The dating methods that have been refined over the past decades should be applied to every suitable sample from every accessible site. The astronomical alignments that have been claimed at dozens of sites should be independently verified by qualified astronomers and archaeoastronomers. We owe it intellectual honesty. That means being willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads to conclusions that challenge the official narrative. And it means being equally willing to acknowledge when evidence is insufficient to support a specific conclusion. No matter how appealing that conclusion might be, we owe it respect. The people who built these structures were not props in our story. They were fully human beings, living fully human lives, with concerns and hopes and fears, and relationships, and a deep understanding of the landscape they inhabited. Whatever we conclude about their origins and their connections, we should approach the evidence of their lives and their building with the respect that any human achievement deserves, and we owe it to ourselves, because the story of who we are is built from all of our human past, not just the portion of it that was captured in writing by people with access to writing materials and the leisure to use them. The stone structures of the Appalachians are part of the story of humanity on this continent. The full human story on this continent is longer and more complex and more impressive than the official version acknowledges. And we are all in some sense impoverished by the gaps in that story, by the chapters that have been dismissed or ignored or simply not investigated. The mountains hold more than we know. They always have. In the small hours of the night, when the world is quietest, the mind tends to make connections that the daylight hours refuse to allow. You are lying here somewhere in the world, and the story of these mountains is settling into you, the way rain settles into soil. Not analyzed, not resolved, just absorbed, the way old things are absorbed. The people who stood in those stone chambers and watched the solstice light travel across the Van did not know that we would be here, thousands of years later, trying to understand what they licks. And why? They were simply living their lives, doing the things that their traditions told them were important, marking the significant moments of the solar year with precision and ceremony, making sure that the world stayed on course, that the sun returned, that the seasons continued to turn in their proper order. That impulse to mark the turning of the year, to acknowledge the mystery of time and light, and the regularity behind the apparent chaos of the natural world, is still with us. We have different ways of expressing it, but the underlying human need, the need to stand at specific moments and say, "The world is turning, and I am here, and I acknowledge this," that need has not changed. The stones in the Appalachians are, among other things, evidence that this need is very old, older than the traditions we know, older than the histories we have written, part of something deep in human consciousness that preceded all our formal institutions and will outlast them. That is worth knowing. That is worth the long walk in the dark. There is a final thing worth saying about the Appalachian megalithic mystery, And it is perhaps the most important thing. The mountains are still there. The stones are still there. The mystery is still open. At this moment, as you are listening to this, somewhere in the Appalachian chain, there are stone structures that no researcher has visited this century. Possibly no researcher has visited in living memory. There are alignments that no one has measured, chambers that no one has dated, walls that no one has mapped. There are petroglyphs weathering in isolation on boulders deep in hollows that no trail passes through. There are cairns on ridges so remote that the only visitors in recent decades have been ravens and the wind. The evidence is not lost. It is simply waiting. Waiting for the curiosity, the resources, the intellectual honesty, and the political will to take it seriously. History is not finished being written. The story of who lived in these mountains, and what they built, and why, and where they came from, and where they went, is still incomplete. The chapters we have are fragments. The chapters we are missing are more numerous than the ones we have. But the stones are patient. They have been patient for a very long time, and the mountains are not going anywhere. Somewhere out in the darkness, past the last light of the last town, up on a ridge where the old oaks lean over old stone, the mystery rests in its permanence, neither demanding nor retreating, simply there, the way the mountains themselves are simply there, old beyond our categories of old, quiet beyond our concepts of quiet. And tomorrow, or in some tomorrows to come, someone will walk up through the trees and find something they did not expect, a stone in a position that could not be accidental, a chamber that the forest has been keeping secret, a wall that leads somewhere, that points somewhere, that means something. And the mystery will open a little further, and the mountains will wait for the next question, and the stones, as they have always done, will hold their silence, patient, permanent, and full of things we have not yet learned to hear. Sleep well. The mountains are old, and the stars are steady, and the mystery is in good hands tonight, held by the same darkness that has held it for 10,000 years. Tomorrow, the questions will still be there. But tonight, the stones are quiet, and the ridges are dark, and the only sound is the wind in the old trees, older than anything we have built or imagined, older than our names for things carrying the same message it has always carried through these mountains. Be still. Listen. The old world is still here. Let us begin again in a different place, with a different kind of stone. The eastern face of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where they drop steeply toward the Virginia Piedmont, is a geological boundary that has mattered to human beings for a very long time. The rocks that make up the Blue Ridge core are among the oldest in the Appalachian system, ancient metamorphic and igneous formations that have been compressed and recrystallized, under heat and pressure, multiple times over geological history. These rocks have a quality that other Appalachian stones do not always share. They fracture cleanly. They break along natural plains. They produce large, flat slabs of relatively predictable shape. This matters because large, flat slabs of predictable shape are the raw material of megalithic architecture. You cannot build a cobble chamber from rounded river cobbles. You cannot cap a standing stone entrance with a randomly shaped boulder. The geometry of megalithic construction requires stone that can be reliably shaped or selected in flat, manageable pieces, and the Blue Ridge along its eastern face provides that stone in abundance. The quartzite outcroppings along the Blue Ridge front have been used by human beings for tool manufacture for at least 12,000 years. Paleo-Indian sites in the Piedmont below the mountains consistently show the use of Blue Ridge, quartzite for tool production, carried sometimes hundreds of miles from its source. The quartzite was valued for its workability, its hardness, its ability to hold a sharp edge, but quartzite was also used at certain sites in the Blue Ridge foothills for construction. Standing stones of Blue Ridge quartzite appear at several sites in the transition zone between the mountains and the Piedmont, in a part of Virginia that has never been intensively surveyed for megalithic features, but where local knowledge, the knowledge of farmers and hunters and people who have walked these hills for generations, preserves accounts of unusual stone arrangements in the woods. One account, collected by a local historian in the 1950s, describes a site in a creek hollow west of Charlottesville, Virginia, where a group of standing stones was visible within living memory of the informants. The stones were described as arranged in an oval, roughly 30 feet across, with a central stone, taller than the others, perhaps 5 feet in height. The site was on private land, and the landowner at the time of the account had apparently cleared the area for pasture, moving or breaking some of the stones. The historian who collected the account noted that she could not verify its accuracy, and that no physical remains of the site were visible at the time she visited. This is frustrating, but typical. Oral accounts of stone sites are often the only record that survives after development or agricultural clearing has disturbed or destroyed the physical evidence. The site near Charlottesville may have been significant. It may have been a medieval field boundary. It may have been something in between. We will never know, because the investigation did not happen when the evidence was intact. The archaeological record of the Shenandoah Valley contains a significant absence that has not been adequately explained. The valley was inhabited continuously for thousands of years by indigenous peoples. That is documented. The material culture record, the pottery and stone tools and bone refuse of daily life, shows occupations stretching back at least 10,000 years. The valley's rich bottomland soil and reliable water sources made it an exceptionally good place to live. But the record of permanent construction in the valley is thin. For a place that was inhabited so long and so continuously, there is surprisingly little in the way of lasting built evidence. The earthwork tradition that produced the great mounds of the Ohio Valley did not apparently extend into the Shenandoah in any significant way. The stone construction tradition that characterizes the flanking mountains appears only sporadically in the valley bottom. Some researchers have proposed that this absence is not an absence of construction, but an absence of preservation. The valley floor, with its rich agricultural potential, has been farmed continuously since European settlement. The colonial-era clearing, plowing, and subsequent farming of Shenandoah Valley bottomland would have destroyed most surface archaeological features that were not substantially buried or built from the most massive materials. What has survived in the valley are the sites on the slopes and ridges above the farmed bottomland, and in those higher locations, the stone structure evidence does appear. Walls on ridge crests, cairns on hilltops, chamber-like features tucked into hillsides with southern exposures and spring sources nearby. The pattern suggests that the stone structure tradition was not absent from the valley. It was present in the uplands, in the places that farming has not reached, in the places where the forest has kept its secret for all the centuries since the valley was first settled by Europeans. The question of astronomical knowledge in pre-Columbian North America deserves its own extended discussion. There is a persistent cultural habit of imagining ancient peoples as astronomically naive, as people who looked up at the sky and saw only mystery, who had no systematic framework for understanding the movements of celestial bodies. This habit is not supported by the evidence. The Anadzi people of the American Southwest built structures that tracked the movements of the sun and moon with extraordinary precision. Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon is aligned so that the rising sun on the winter solstice illuminates a specific doorway in the Great House. The fad-sunned dagger marks the solstices and equinoxes through the interaction of spiral petroglyphs with shafts of sunlight passing between stone slabs. The entire layout of Chaco Canyon appears to incorporate astronomical alignments across a landscape scale. The Mississippian peoples of the central United States tracked celestial events with the same seriousness. The Cahokia woodhangers, circular arrangements of large cedar posts, reconstructed by archaeologists from the post-hole patterns they left in the ground, were apparently used to mark the solstices and equinoxes through the rising of the sun over specific features of the surrounding landscape. The Hopewell earthworks of the Ohio Valley incorporate astronomical alignments that have been confirmed by rigorous modern analysis. The Newark earthworks, the most extensive of the Hopewell geometric enclosures, are aligned to the lunar standstill cycle with a precision that required sustained observation of the moon's movements over a period of at least 6 years, the length of the lunar nodal cycle. These are not simple or unsophisticated astronomical achievements. Tracking the lunar standstill requires careful observation over more than a generation. Building earthworks or stone structures aligned to it requires the ability to translate years of observational data into precise spatial relationships. This is exactly the kind of astronomical knowledge and engineering competence that the rebuilders of Stonehenge and New Grange possessed. The astronomical traditions of the pre-Columbian Americas were diverse, complex, and in some respects more sophisticated than the astronomical traditions of contemporaneous Old World cultures. The idea that the Appalachian stone structure builders, whoever they were, lacked the astronomical knowledge to produce the alignments that researchers have documented at New England and mid-Atlantic sites is not defensible. The broader pre-Columbian cultural world of eastern North America clearly possessed that knowledge. The question is not whether the builders could have produced precise astronomical alignments. They clearly could have. The question is whether the specific tradition of stone chamber and standing stone construction in the Appalachian represents an indigenous expression of that knowledge, a transoceanic import of similar traditions from the Old World, or some combination of the two. The role of women in ancient ceremonial traditions is a subject that archaeology has historically underemphasized. The dominant narrative in early archaeology, reflecting the biases of the era in which it was developed, tended to attribute major cultural achievements, construction projects, astronomical knowledge, long-distance trade, religious leadership to men. Women appeared in the archaeological record primarily as subjects of burial analysis defined by their fertility or their proximity to high-status males. More recent scholarship has significantly revised this picture. Genetic analysis of burial populations has revealed that what was previously assumed to be the burial of a male leader is often the burial of a female. Isotope analysis has shown that women in many prehistoric cultures move between communities more frequently than men, which in a trade-based exchange system places women in the role of long-distance traders and cultural brokers rather than stay-at-home subordinates. Evidence from hunter-gatherer societies worldwide suggests that women often possessed the most sophisticated ecological knowledge in the community. The detailed botanical and zoological knowledge that made the difference between thriving and starving in the context of the Appalachian megalithic tradition. This revisionary perspective raises interesting questions. The astronomical knowledge required to orient chambers and standing stones to specific solar events is not inherently male knowledge. In many traditional societies, kundrakal knowledge was specifically the domain of women, linked to the feminine identification of lunar cycles, menstrual cycles, and the cycles of agricultural and gathering production. A tradition in which women served as the primary observers and recorders of astronomical phenomena would produce a tradition of astronomical architecture that expressed women's relationship to the solar year. Some researchers have noted that the winter solstice sunrise, the most common astronomical alignment in New England stone chambers, has been associated with female deity figures in multiple Old World megalithic traditions. The Irish Passage tombs, New Grange, most famously were associated in later mythology with goddess figures and with the regeneration of life at the darkest point of the year. The winter solstice, as a feminine event, marking the moment when the year's darkness reaches its greatest extent and then begins to reverse, points back toward the return of light and life. And growth is a culturally widespread association. If the stone chamber builders of the Appalachian shared this symbolic framework, understanding the winter solstice as a pivotal moment in a feminine cosmological cycle, then the chambers were not simply astronomical instruments. They were expressions of a specific way of understanding the relationship between human beings, particularly women, and the movements of the sun. They were places where women gathered on the longest night to mark the moment of return, to celebrate the beginning of the slow journey back toward light. This interpretation is speculative. The evidence does not allow us to specify the gender dynamics of the people who built and used the Appalachian chambers, but it is worth noting that the systematic exclusion of women from the story of these structures while reflecting the biases of the researchers who have studied them, is not required by the evidence. The builders of these monuments may have included, or been primarily women. The persistence of indigenous sacred sites in the modern landscape deserves consideration as evidence in its own right. Many of the sites that researchers have identified as significant in the Appalachian megalithic tradition are places that have been recognized as significant by indigenous communities for as long as those communities have maintained oral traditions about the landscape. This is not always publicly known. Indigenous sacred geography is not typically shared with the general public for the very good reasons we have already discussed. But researchers who have engaged respectfully with indigenous knowledge holders have sometimes learned that specific sites that appear in the alternative archaeology literature as mysterious or unexplained have been known to indigenous people for generations as places of power or spiritual significance. This convergence between indigenous sacred geography and the locations of stone structures is not absolute. Not every indigenous sacred site contains stone structures, and not every stone structure is in a location that indigenous oral tradition identifies as significant. But the overlap is substantial enough to be informative. It suggests, first, that indigenous peoples maintained awareness of the stone structures over long periods of time. Even after the specific traditions of the builders had been lost or transformed, the structures were incorporated into the sacred geography of cultures that came after the builders, recognized as significant even when the specific significance was no longer understood in its original terms. It suggests, second, that the locations chosen by the builders were not arbitrary. They were positions in the landscape that have been recognized as significant by multiple generations of human beings using multiple cultural frameworks. This may reflect something about the phenomenological qualities of those locations, the way they interact with light and sound and topography that makes them feel significant to human beings across cultural differences. Or it may reflect a transmission of knowledge so ancient and so deep that it cannot be clearly attributed to any specific historical tradition. Either possibility is interesting. Both possibilities deserve investigation. The construction of a megalithic stone chamber is not a simple undertaking. Let us try to understand what it actually required. Consider a typical New England stone chamber. The chamber has walls built from stones, averaging perhaps 200 pounds each, with some stones significantly heavier. The roofing slabs, which must span the full width of the chamber interior and support their own weight without cracking, average perhaps 2 to 3 tons each. And a typical chamber has 3 or 4 roofing slabs. The total weight of stone in a modest chamber might be in the range of 20 to 40 tons. This stone had to be quarried or selected at a source. The selection of stone for chamber construction is not random. The total builders needed stone that was the right size, the right shape, and the right geological character to perform its structural function without cracking or spoiling under to sand the loads it would carry. Finding suitable stone in sufficient quantity for a complete chamber might require searching a significant area of terrain. The source quarry for the Upton chamber stones, for example, appears to have been an outcrop roughly half a mile from the chamber site. Moving 40 tons of stone half a mile across terrain that includes both forested hillside and a stream crossing would require at minimum a work party of 20 to 30 people, equipped with wooden rollers, levers, ropes, and the organizational knowledge to coordinate their efforts. With primitive tools and difficult terrain, moving even a single 3-ton roofing slab might be a full day's work for a substantial work party. The total labor investment in a single chamber from quarrying to final placement was probably measured in weeks or months of collective effort. Then there is the astronomical orientation. Before construction could begin, the builders had to know the precise direction of the specific celestial event they were aligning to. For a winter solstice chamber, they needed to know exactly where the sun would rise on the shortest day of the year. This could only be determined through prior observation at the same site over at least one full year, marking the sunrise positions at various times and identifying the extreme position at the solstice. This implies that chamber construction was preceded by a period of site preparation and observation. The builders visited the intended construction site, established observation markers, watched the sun through a full calendar year, identified the solstice sunrise direction, and then began the work of building in alignment with that direction. This sequence requires both astronomical knowledge and patience. The total investment in a single stone chamber from initial site selection to final completion might span 2 to 3 years of periodic collective activity. For a small community of perhaps 50 to 100 people, this represents a significant commitment of resources and social attention. Why make that commitment? What was worth that investment? In the context of what we have discussed about the ceremonial and spiritual functions of these chambers, the astronomical alignments, the acoustic properties, the positional relationship to springs and significant landscape features, the answer seems to be that the chambers were understood as essential community infrastructure, not in the practical sense of a granary or a dwelling, but in the spiritual and social sense of a place where the community enacted its relationship with the cosmos, a place where the fundamental cycles of time were marked and acknowledged, a place where the dead were honored and the living were initiated into the traditions of the culture. In many ancient societies, the investment in ceremonial architecture exceeded the investment in practical architecture by significant margins. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe consumed resources that could have built many thousands of houses. The Hopewell earthworks of Ohio were built with labor that could have cleared and farmed hundreds of additional acres. The Appalachian stone chambers represent the same kind of investment in the sacred and the enduring at a smaller scale, but with the same underlying logic. The New England landscape in winter has a quality that is hard to describe to someone who has not experienced it. The snow-covered hillsides, the bare black branches against a white sky, the cold that is not merely physical, but seems to carry a spiritual quality, a stillness, a suspension of ordinary activity that allows other things to become visible. In this landscape, the stone chambers have a particular presence. They do not look like something that belongs to the modern world. They look like something left over from a different order of things. Their stones are dark against the snow. Their interiors are sheltered from wind and cold in a way that draws attention to the contrast between the harsh exterior and the protected space within. Indigenous peoples of New England described these chambers in the accounts recorded by early the tour European settlers as places that were old before their own oldest memories, places that had been there when the people came to the land, places that belonged to the time before. That description, the time before, is doing a lot of work. It marks a threshold in cultural memory, beyond which specific knowledge gives way to a more general awareness of great antiquity. The chambers were old, they were important, they were places of power, but the specific tradition that created them, the specific purposes they served, the specific community that built and maintained them, that knowledge was gone, or had been transformed beyond recognition into a different cultural framework. This transformation of specific knowledge into a more general sense of antiquity and significance is a common pattern in the relationship between human communities and the ancient structures in their landscapes. The medieval Europeans who lived near Stonehenge did not know who built it or why, but they knew it was significant. They attached stories to it, stories about giants and Merlin and ancient kings, stories that were not literally accurate, but that preserved the awareness that something important had happened in that place. The indigenous traditions of the Appalachian have done something similar with the stone structures. The specific knowledge is gone, or has been preserved in restricted ceremonial contexts that are not shared with outsiders. But the general awareness of significance, the sense that these are places where the world is different, where something essential happened, that awareness has persisted. It has been encoded in place names and sacred geography narratives, and the collective memory of communities that have lived in and around these mountains for generations. That encoded awareness is itself evidence. Imprecise evidence, but real evidence. It tells us that the stone structures mattered, that they mattered to people other than their builders, that they have been integrated into the human relationship with this landscape across the long span of time between their construction and the present. The southern end of the Appalachian Range, in the mountains of Alabama and northern Georgia, and the Carolinas, holds its own chapter in this long story. The Talladega Mountains of Alabama, part of the southern Appalachian chain, contains stone structures that have received almost no attention from researchers or the public. This is partly because the structures in Alabama sit in a region that is further from the centers of alternative archaeology investigation in New England and that lacks the tradition of amateur survey that has documented many New England sites. But the structures are there. Local hunters and farmers in the Talladega region have known about them for generations. Stone walls following ridge crests for significant distances, piles of large stones on hilltops that are too regular and too deliberately placed to be natural. A chamber-like structure in a hollow near a spring, known locally as the Indian Cave, though it is not a natural cave, but a built structure that has been a landmark in the local landscape for as long as anyone can remember. The geological context of the southern Appalachian is important. The southern mountains are older and more deeply eroded than the northern mountains. The rock types are different, dominated by metamorphic formations, including schist and gneiss, and quartzite, rather than the granite, that characterizes much of the New England stone structure zone. The workability of southern Appalachian stone is in some ways more challenging than the workability of New England granite, which tends to fracture along more predictable plains. This means that construction in the southern Appalachian required adaptation of building techniques to different materials. The builders of stone structures in Alabama and northern Georgia were working with stone that behaved differently from what their counterparts in Vermont and New Hampshire encountered. The fact that stone structures appear in both regions, built from very different materials but sharing certain common architectural principles, suggests either a very widespread tradition that adapted to local materials or multiple independent developments that converged on similar forms. The similar functional requirements of the structures providing sheltered acoustic spaces with specific astronomical orientations would tend to produce convergent solutions even in the absence of cultural connection. But the specific architectural choices, the way entrances are formed, the method of corbelling where it appears, the selection of roofing stone dimensions are suggestive enough of a common tradition that independent development is not the most parsimonious explanation. The way stories travel is instructive. Before writing, before the printing press, before radio and television and the internet, stories moved on feet and on boats. They traveled with traders and with pilgrims and with refugees. They changed as they moved, adapted to new contexts, absorbed local color, lost details that were irrelevant to new audiences, and gained details that made them comprehensible in new settings. But the core of a story, the essential pattern that makes it worth telling, has a remarkable persistence. The story of a great flood that destroyed a previous world and required the survival of a small group of humans and animals to begin again appears in Mesopotamian texts, in the Hebrew Bible, in Greek mythology, in indigenous traditions across both Americas, in flood traditions from Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. The specific details vary enormously. The core pattern is remarkably stable. The story of a culture, hero, or trickster figure who obtains fire, or light, or knowledge, for humanity, appears across an equally extraordinary range of cultures. The story of an underworld or afterlife realm that the living can access under specific conditions. The story of divine or supernatural beings who mated with humans and produced offspring who are neither fully divine nor fully human. These pattern stories appear everywhere, that humans have told stories across all the oceans and all the millennia of recorded human culture. What does this have to do with the Appalachian stone structures? The traditions associated with megalithic monuments in the Old World often share specific narrative elements. The idea that the monuments were built by giants or supernatural beings. The idea that the monument has healing properties. The idea that specific behaviors at the monument, offerings, prayers, seasonal rites, can influence fertility or the agricultural year. The idea that the monument is a portal to an underworld or a realm of the ancestors. The idea that the monument is connected to specific stars or constellations. Versions of all of these narrative elements appear in indigenous American traditions associated with ancient stone structures, including structures in the Appalachian. Giants who built in stone appear in Cherokee and other southern Appalachian traditions. Healing associations are attached to specific stone sites in multiple eastern North American traditions. Fertility and agricultural connections are documented for ceremonial stone sites among cultures from the northeastern Algonquian peoples to the Iroquois. Ancestral connections are central to virtually every indigenous understanding of stone structures in the region. Does this mean that the indigenous traditions are descended from Old World megalithic traditions? Or does it mean that the same story patterns attach themselves to stone monuments across cultures, because there is something about the human experience of ancient stone structures that consistently generates the same kinds of meaning? The honest answer is that we cannot distinguish between these possibilities from the evidence currently available. Both are plausible. Both may be partially true. The fog comes into the Appalachian valleys on certain mornings in the early spring in a way that is almost impossible to describe adequately. It moves up from the creek bottoms and the hollows, filling the low places, and the ridges emerge from it like islands, the bare hardwoods above the fog line, vivid against the pale sky. From a ridge, you can watch the fog move. It is alive in the way that only large-scale natural phenomena are alive, carrying its own slow momentum, curling around hillsides, pooling in the curves of the valley. Watching this, it is not difficult to understand why the ancient peoples of these mountains understood the landscape as animated, not metaphorically, but actually literally animated, full of movement and life and intention. The fog is not doing what fog does in a physics class. It is doing what fog does in a living world. And the living world has purposes that human beings do not always comprehend. The people who built stone chambers in the hollows and on the hillsides of the Appalachians were people who watched this fog from these same ridges for generations, who knew the specific patterns of mist in their specific valleys, the way it pulled in certain spots on certain mornings, the way it cleared from one hillside before another, the way a spring morning fog predicted a warm afternoon or a cold one. This knowledge was not decorative. It was survival knowledge, informing decisions about when to plant and when to harvest and when to move camp and when to stay. The chambers and walls and standing stones these people built were embedded in this knowing, this accumulated understanding of a specific landscape in its specific moods and seasons. The astronomical alignments were not abstract geometry. They were expressions of a relationship with the sun, a relationship measured over years and generations, intimate in the way that only a long acquaintance can be intimate. We inherit the landscape, but not the knowledge. We can walk the same ridges and look at the same horizons, but the accumulation of observation and meaning that made those ridges and horizons legible to the builders of these structures is not available to us. We are reading a text in a language we have only partially reconstructed. The number of undocumented sites in the Appalachian is by definition unknown, but the density of documented sites in surveyed areas suggests that the total number of stone structures in the mountains, if a comprehensive survey were ever conducted, would be in the thousands. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of stone structures, built by human hands, scattered across a mountain range that runs 2,000 meters through the eastern United States, the vast majority of them unknown to official archaeology, unstudied, undated, their builders unidentified. This is not a small mystery. This is one of the largest unresolved questions in American prehistoric archaeology, and it has been allowed to remain unresolved. Not because the tools to investigate it are unavailable, not because the intellectual frameworks for making sense of it do not exist, but because the institutional will to take the question seriously has never been mustered. The question of why that institutional will has been absent is worth sitting with. It connects to the larger issues of colonial history and the politics of knowledge that we touched on earlier. It connects to the way that academic disciplines define their boundaries and defend their boundaries. It connects to the chronic underfunding of American archaeology compared to the scale of what needs to be investigated. And it connects to a cultural habit of thinking about North America as a place where significant things only started happening recently. A habit so deeply ingrained that even asking about pre-Columbian complexity feels transgressive. The stones in the mountains do not care about any of this. They were there before the academic disciplines were founded. They will be there after current controversies are forgotten. They hold their mystery with extraordinary patience. The Mississippian culture's influence on the Appalachian highlands in the centuries before European contact is documented most clearly in the ceramic and material culture record. Mississippian-style pottery, with its distinctive shell-tempered construction and incised, decorative motifs, has been found at sites throughout the southern Appalachians. Mississippian prestige goods, shell gorgets, and copper plates and ceramic effigies appear at sites in the mountain zone that were otherwise occupied by local cultures maintaining their own traditions. This pattern of Mississippian influence, reaching into the mountains without fully replacing local traditions, is consistent with what anthropologists call a peer-polity interaction sphere, a system in which distinct regional cultures maintain their own identities while exchanging goods, ideas, and prestige items with neighboring complex societies. The mountain communities were not provinces of Cahokia. They were independent entities that participated in the broader Mississippian exchange system on their own terms. What this suggests is that the people living in the Appalachian highlands in the centuries before European contact were not culturally isolated. They were participants in a larger cultural world that included the major urban centers of the Mississippi Valley and the complex chiefdoms of the coastal plain. They had access to ideas and innovations that circulated through that broader world. If the stone structure tradition of the Appalachians was still active during this period, which the available dates suggest it was in some areas, then it was not a relic of a forgotten past, but a living tradition practiced by people who were also participating in the broader cultural world of pre-Columbian eastern North America. That picture is significantly more complex and interesting than the image of isolated mountain peoples that has sometimes been invoked to explain away the stone structures. The mountain Cherokee have a tradition about a ceremony that was performed at stone sites on the night of the first new moon after the winter solstice. The ceremony involved the lighting of new fire. New fire started fresh rather than carried from the previous year's flame, and the distribution of that new fire to all the households of the community. The new fire represented a new beginning, a fresh start for the year that the winter solstice had just turned toward the light. The stone site where the new fire was kindled was not a random location. It was a specific place that had been associated with this ceremony for as long as the oral tradition could remember. A place where the ancestors had performed the same ceremony in the same way, and where the trance ceremony had a particular power because of the accumulated weight of all the times it had been performed before. This tradition, reported by James Mooney in his monumental 19th-century study of Cherokee culture and oral tradition, is one of the clearest documented connections between Cherokee ceremonial practice and specific stone sites. The new fire ceremony was one of the most important ceremonial events in the Cherokee calendar, a point of cosmic renewal at which the accumulated bad luck and pollution of the previous year were burned away, and the community began again with clean fire and clean relationships. The association of this ceremony with stone sites, with places where the ancestors had gathered for the same purpose, is precisely the kind of connection between built stone environments and purpose, ceremonial practice, that we would expect from the broader megalithic tradition we have been discussing. It does not prove that the stone sites in question were built by the Cherokee or by their immediate predecessors, but it shows that the Cherokee at the time of European contact understood stone sites in their landscape as ceremonial locations, with deep time depth as places where the ancestral practices of their culture had been enacted, and where the power of those practices was accumulated and available. That understanding is itself an inheritance from whoever came before. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes with investigating an unsolved mystery. The researchers who have spent years walking the Appalachian forests and documenting stone structures know this loneliness well. The work is done largely in isolation, without institutional support, without the collegial network of shared projects and peer review and conference presentations that sustain researchers in mainstream fields. You find something in the woods, you measure it and photograph it and record its position. You write it up as carefully as you can, and then you send it out into a world that largely does not want to hear it. Some researchers respond to this situation by becoming more extreme in their claims, reaching for the most dramatic explanation, because dramatic explanations attract attention even when careful ones do not. This is understandable but unfortunate. The dramatic explanations often outrun the evidence and invite the kind of dismissal that the legitimate evidence does not deserve. Others respond by becoming more cautious, more careful, more modest in their claims. They document what they find and leave the interpretation as open as the evidence requires. They acknowledge uncertainty. They resist the temptation to connect every dot, and they publish what they find in the small journals and newsletters and websites that constitute the alternative archaeology community's infrastructure of communication. These careful, honest researchers are doing something valuable. They are creating a record imperfect, incomplete, methodologically uneven, but real, a record of what exists in the mountains, documented as faithfully as they are able to document it. When the institutional resources and intellectual will to investigate these questions properly eventually emerge, and the history of science suggests that they will, that record will be where any serious investigation begins. The mystery is patient. The mountains are patient. The evidence, imperfectly preserved and imperfectly recorded as it is patient, and the question of who built what in these mountains and why will eventually receive the investigation it deserves. Let us think for a moment about deep time, not the geological deep time of the mountains themselves, which we touched on at the beginning, but the deep time of human habitation. 15,000 years is a long time in human terms. It spans roughly 600 generations of people. A generation is long enough for the world to change significantly. 600 generations is long enough for the entire recorded history of human civilization to happen, multiple times over. Languages rise and fall. Cultures transform beyond recognition. Technologies emerge and are forgotten and rediscovered. Climates shift. Coastlines change. The world that the first post-glacial inhabitants of the Appalachians knew was physically different from the world we know today. Colder, with different plant communities, different animal populations, different patterns of water and ice and vegetation. In those 15,000 years, the people of the Appalachian went through changes that we can barely trace in the archaeological record. Cultures formed and dissolved and reformed. Languages evolved and diverged. Technologies were developed and sometimes lost. Trade networks connected distant communities and then contracted as political circumstances changed. Sacred traditions were maintained for centuries and then abandoned or transformed. Through all of this, people built in stone, not constantly, not everywhere, not in all periods with equal intensity, but the impulse to mark the landscape in durable materials, to create spaces that would outlast any individual or generation, to encode in stone the knowledge and beliefs and relationships that mattered most. That impulse recurred across many different cultural moments in many different parts of the Appalachian chain. The stone structures we are discussing are the surviving nodes in this 15,000-year network of human activity. They are the places where the impulse to build in stone was strong enough and the conditions favorable enough to produce structures durable enough to survive to the present. For every structure that has survived, how many were built in locations less protected from erosion and development and did not survive? For every structure that we have found, how many remain hidden under the leaf litter of unvisited hollows? The surviving stones represent a small sample of a large phenomenon, and understanding even that small sample requires a willingness to take seriously a span of human time that our ordinary categories of history and prehistory do not adequately address. The night deepens further. The wind has picked up slightly. Moving through the canopy of the old oaks, in a sound that is ancient and familiar. The spring is still running somewhere in the hollow below, its small voice carrying through the darkness. The stone chamber is holding its own quiet. The moss on its roof is wet with dew. The entrance is dark, a rectangle of deeper darkness against the dark hillside. In 12 days, as we said, the solstice sunrise will enter that entrance and travel the length of the passage to illuminate the back wall of the chamber. In 12 days, whoever is here will see what the builders designed for people to see. The thin winter light finding its way through the narrow passage, arriving at the back wall like a message delivered after a very long journey. That message will not be decoded on that morning. The specific meaning that the builders embedded in that moment of light and stone and alignment is lost to us. But the fact of the message, the fact that it was designed, that it was intended, that someone cared enough about that specific moment in the solar year to invest months or years of collective labor in creating a place where it could be witnessed and honored. That fact speaks across all the silence. We do not need to know what the message says to know that it was meant. We do not need to decode the specific language of a tradition we have lost to recognize the impulse behind it, to mark the years turning to acknowledge the return of light, to stand at the threshold of the darkest point and say we are here. The sun is here. The cycle continues. We are part of this. We belong to this turning world. That message we can read not in any script we have been taught, but in the language of stone and light and time. That is in the end perhaps the most universal language of all. What do we owe to the mystery? We owe it serious investigation. The evidence that exists deserves rigorous study by researchers with the tools and credentials to do it properly. The LiDAR technology that revealed the extent of Anchor and the Maya cities should be applied systematically to the Appalachian highlands. The dating methods that have been refined over the past decades should be applied to every suitable sample from every accessible site. The astronomical alignments that have been claimed at dozens of sites should be independently verified by qualified astronomers and archaeoastronomers. We owe it intellectual honesty. That means being willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads to conclusions that challenge the official narrative. And it means being equally willing to acknowledge when evidence is insufficient to support a specific conclusion, no matter how appealing that conclusion might be. We owe it respect. The people who built these structures were not props in our story. They were fully human beings living fully human lives with concerns and hopes and fears and relationships and a deep understanding of the landscape they inhabited. Whatever we conclude about their origins and their connections, we should approach the evidence of their lives and their building with the respect that any human achievement deserves, and we owe it to ourselves, because the story of who we are is built from all of our human past, not just the portion of it that was captured in writing by people with access to writing materials and the leisure to use them. The stone structures of the Appalachian are part of the story of humanity on this continent. The full human story on this continent is longer and more complex and more impressive than the tanning acknowledges. And we are all in some sense impoverished by the gaps in that story, by the chapters that have been dismissed or ignored or simply not investigated. The mountains hold more than we know. They always have. In the small hours of the night, when the world is quietest, the mind tends to make connections that the daylight hours refuse to allow. You are lying here somewhere in the world, and the story of these mountains is settling into you the way rain settles into soil. Not analyzed, not resolved, just absorbed, the way old things are absorbed. The people who stood in those stone chambers and watched the solstice light travel across this year did not know that we would be here thousands of years later, trying to understand what they built and why. They were simply living their lives, doing the things that their traditions told them were important, marking the significant moments of the solar year with precision and ceremony, making sure that the world stayed on course, that the sun returned, that the seasons continued to turn in their proper order. That impulse to mark the turning of the year, to acknowledge the mystery of time and light and the regularity behind the apparent chaos of the natural world, is still with us. We have different ways of expressing it. But the underlying human need, the need to stand at specific moments and say, "The world is turning, and I am here, and I acknowledge this." That need has not changed. The stones in the Appalachian are, among other things, evidence that this need is very old, older than the traditions we know, older than the histories we have written, part of something deep in human consciousness that preceded all our formal institutions and will outlast them. That is worth knowing. That is worth the long walk in the dark. There is a final thing worth saying about the Appalachian megalithic mystery, and it is perhaps the most important thing. The mountains are still there. The stones are still there. The mystery is still open. At this moment, as you are listening to this, somewhere in the Appalachian chain, there are stone structures that no researcher has visited this century. Possibly no researcher has visited in living memory. There are alignments that no one has measured, chambers that no one has dated, walls that no one has mapped. There are petroglyphs weathering in isolation on boulders deep in hollows that no trail passes through. There are cairns on ridge crests so remote that the only visitors in recent decades have been ravens and the wind. The evidence is not lost. It is simply waiting. Waiting for the curiosity, the resources, the intellectual honesty, and the political will to take it seriously. History is not finished being written. The story of who lived in these mountains, and what they built and why, and where they came from, and where they went, is still incomplete. The chapters we have are fragments. The chapters we are missing are more numerous than the ones we have. But the stones are patient. They have been patient for a very long time. And the mountains are not going anywhere. Somewhere out in the darkness, past the last light of the last town, up on a ridge where the old oaks lean over old stone, the mystery rests in its permanence, neither demanding nor retreating, simply there, the way the mountains themselves are simply there, old beyond our categories of old, quiet beyond our concepts of quiet. And tomorrow, or in some tomorrows to come, someone will walk up through the trees and find something they did not expect. A stone in a position that could not be accidental, a chamber that the forest has been keeping secret, a wall that leads somewhere that points somewhere that means something, and the mystery will open a little further, and the mountains will wait for the next question, and the stones, as they have always done, will hold their silence, patient, permanent, and full of things we have not yet learned to hear. Sleep well. The mountains are old and the stars are steady, and the mystery is in good hands tonight, held by the same darkness that has held it for 10,000 years. Tomorrow the questions will still be there. But tonight the stones are quiet, and the ridges are dark, and the only sound is the wind in the old trees, older than anything we have built or imagined, older than our names for things, carrying the same message it has always carried through these mountains. Be still. Listen. The old world is still here. There is a creek in eastern Tennessee that no map names correctly. The locals call it by a shortened version of an older name. And the older name is itself a corruption of something even older, a Cherokee word that referred not to the creek itself, but to a stone structure near its headwaters. The structure the Cherokee word referred to is still there. It sits at the edge of the creek in a narrow hollow where the water has cut down through limestone to the bedrock below, and it consists of 3 large limestone slabs fitted together into a low covered space, its entrance facing upstream, its interior large enough to hold 2 or 3 people seated. The structure is not remarkable by the standards of the chambers we have already discussed. It is smaller than the Upton Chamber, less elaborate than the Gungywamp site, less dramatically positioned than the White Mountain Ken clusters, but it has a quality that the more famous sites sometimes lack. It feels unused. It feels as though it has been sitting in this hollow, untouched and unvisited for a very long time. The limestone around it has weathered in ways that geologists can roughly date. The stone surfaces that were exposed to weathering when the structure was built show a depth of dissolution and recrystallization that suggests several centuries of exposure, at minimum. The stones that were protected by the structure's assembly, the interior surfaces show markedly less weathering. This differential weathering pattern is what you would expect from a structure that was built some centuries ago and has not been significantly disturbed since. The mosses and lichens on the exterior surfaces include species that colonize stone slowly, species whose presence in the density observed indicates an undisturbed surface for at least a century and possibly considerably longer. This is not precise dating. Linometry is an imprecise tool, especially in the variable moisture conditions of a Tennessee Creek hollow, but it is consistent with the structure being significantly older than the European settlement of the Teta region. Nobody has excavated under the structure. Nobody has radiocarbon dated any organic material associated with it. Nobody has submitted the lichen populations to a formal lichenometric analysis. The structure exists in the record of a single researcher who documented it in the 1990s and shared the documentation with a small circle of colleagues before dying. As researchers in this field sometimes do before their work could be completed, the creek still runs. The hollow is still there. The structure is presumably still standing. If nothing has disturbed it in the intervening decades, someone who knew where to look could find it. The practice of landscape reading, the ability to extract detailed information about the environment from subtle sensory cues, is one of the most sophisticated cognitive skills that human beings developed during the prehistoric period. It is also one of the skills most thoroughly lost in modern urban life, when the indigenous peoples of the Appalachian or the Old World megalithic builders, who may have been their ancestors or their contacts, chose specific locations in the landscape for stone construction. They were drawing on accumulated knowledge of those locations that went far beyond simple observation. They knew the orientation of the slopes and how that orientation affected solar exposure through the seasons. They knew the drainage patterns and how those patterns produced the specific humidity and temperature conditions of each hollow and hilltop. They knew which locations were sheltered from the prevailing winds and which were exposed. They knew the acoustic properties of different terrain configurations, which valleys focused sound and which dispersed it. This knowledge did not come from a single lifetime of observation. It came from generations of accumulated experience, passed down through the oral tradition of a community that had lived in the same landscape for many generations. The people who chose the sites for stone chambers and standing stones and wall systems were drawing on a depth of environmental knowledge that we can barely imagine, much less replicate. The specific qualities that made a particular location suitable for a stone chamber, the combination of astronomical orientation, acoustic properties, water source proximity, visual prominence or hiddenness in the landscape, drainage and temperature conditions that would keep the interior dry and stable. All of these factors had to be evaluated and balanced against each other in the site selection process. The result is that the existing stone chambers tend to be located in positions that maximize all of these factors simultaneously, which is itself evidence of sophisticated environmental knowledge informing the selection process. When we find a chamber tucked into a hillside above a spring with its entrance oriented to the winter solstice, sunrise in a hollow that produces distinctive acoustic effects, and that maintains a stable temperature and humidity through all seasons, we are not finding a random or haphazard structure. We are finding the product of a tradition of landscape knowledge that was as sophisticated in its own domain as any modern engineering tradition. The question of what happened to the builders is in some ways the most poignant dimension of the Appalachian megalithic mystery. Where did they go? The people who invested so much collective labor and knowledge in these structures, who maintained the tradition across what appear to have been many generations, who understood the landscape with an intimacy that their stone constructions still reflect. Where did they go? The most likely answer is that they did not go anywhere. They are still here, in the sense that their biological and cultural descendants are the people who have lived in the Appalachian ever since. The Cherokee and the Lappe and the Shawnee and the dozens of other indigenous peoples whose non-traditional territories encompassed the Appalachians did not spring from nowhere. They are the descendants, however many times removed, of all the people who lived in these mountains through all the generations of the prehistoric period, including, presumably, the people who built in stone. The specific cultural tradition that produced the stone chambers may have ended. Traditions end for many reasons. Climate change that disrupted the agricultural and foraging economies that supported the tradition. Epidemic disease, possibly introduced through early contact with Old World populations, before the historical record begins, that reduced population levels to the point where maintaining complex ceremonial infrastructure became impossible. Political disruption, the kind of large-scale social reorganization that we know occurred in the Ohio Valley with the decline of the Hopewell culture around 400 CE, and in the Mississippi Valley with the decline of Cahokia around 1350 CE. Any of these factors or combinations of them could have brought the active phase of the stone building tradition to an end while leaving the structures themselves in place. The memory of what the structures were and why they were built might have survived in the oral tradition for some generations, gradually transforming from specific technical and ceremonial knowledge into a more general awareness of sacred antiquity. The kind of awareness that shows up in indigenous accounts of places that were important to the ancient ones. This is a melancholy reading of the evidence, but not a hopeless one, because the tradition did not entirely disappear. The knowledge that specific places in the Appalachian landscape are places of power, places where the world is different, places where the ancestors were present, and where something essential happened. That knowledge has persisted. It is held by the Eastern Cherokee, by some Lepe communities, Shawnee traditional knowledge holders, by others whose relationship to this knowledge is not publicly known. The tradition transformed, the form changed, but something essential carried through. There is a moment that comes in the investigation of any deep mystery, when the accumulation of evidence and argument begins to produce a different kind of understanding than intellectual analysis alone can provide. Not certainty, not proof, but something more like recognition. The sense that you have been here before, in some sense that transcends individual memory. The sense that the question you are asking is older than you are, that it has been asked by many people before you, that you are participating in a tradition of inquiry that stretches back beyond any individual investigation. The Appalachian megalithic mystery produces that feeling for many of the people who spend time with it. There is something about standing in a stone chamber, or following a wall through the forest, or sitting beside a standing stone at dawn, that bypasses the analytical mind and speaks to something older and quieter. Not a supernatural experience, not a mystical revelation, but a quality of awareness that the ordinary categories of thought do not quite capture. This quality of experience is itself data of a kind. It tells us something about the power of these places, the power that the builders embedded in their construction through careful site selection and astronomical alignment and acoustic engineering. The chambers work not in the way that a machine works, producing a specific, quantifiable output, but in the way that a great work of architecture works, creating conditions that allow certain kinds of human experience to occur. The builders of these chambers were not naive. They knew what they were doing. They had a theory of how their structures would function, what they would do to human consciousness, what experiences they would facilitate. And that theory was right. The structures still do it. Stand in the Upton Chamber at dawn on the winter solstice, and something happens. Not a supernatural something, but something, a quality of awareness, a sense of the present moment opening onto vast reaches of time, a recognition of the smallness and the significance of the individual human life within the much larger context of the cycles that the chamber was built to honor. That experience does not solve the historical mystery, but it gives you something that the historical mystery, for all its importance, cannot give you alone. It gives you a direct present tense encounter with the intention of the builders, an understanding of what they were trying to create that goes beyond anything that can be said in words. The long history of the Appalachians as a barrier and a corridor gives the stone structures a specific geopolitical significance that has rarely been discussed. The Appalachian chain runs north to south. It presents a formidable obstacle to east-west movement. The major passes are widely spaced. The terrain between them is difficult. In the period before roads and railroads, crossing the Appalachian required either using the established passes, navigating the river valleys that cut through the mountains, or making the slow and difficult climb over the ridges on routes that demanded significant physical exertion and detailed knowledge of the terrain. The groups that controlled the passes controlled the movement of people and goods between the Atlantic coast and the interior. The groups that knew the river routes through the mountains could move between the two sides of the range more easily than others. And the groups that maintained communication networks along the ridges using the kind of hilltop can and standing stone system we have discussed could coordinate across the entire north-south extent of the mountain chain in ways that groups without such networks could not. Control of information is control of power. In a world without writing and without electronic communication, the ability to send messages along a chain of visible markers, to maintain a network of observers positioned at strategic points in the landscape, represented a significant political and military advantage. The stone structures of the Appalachians may have been, among other things, elements of a communication and territorial marking system that helped specific groups maintain their position in the complex political landscape of pre-Columbian eastern North America. This is speculative, but it is grounded in what we know about how other cultures have used visible landscape markers for political purposes. The border stones and tower systems of medieval Europe served analogous functions. The signal fires of ancient Rome, the watchtower systems of the Anazi in the American Southwest. Humans have repeatedly invented versions of the same basic system, a network of visible landmarks that allow message passing and territorial marking across a landscape. The Appalachian stone structures fit this general pattern, even if the specific details of how they were used remain unknown. There is a body of water in northern New Hampshire called Lake Winnipesaukee. It is the largest lake in the state, roughly 21 miles long and 9 miles wide, and it drains through the Merrimack River to the sea. It is surrounded by hills and mountains, and in the autumn, when the leaves are turning, it is strikingly beautiful. On the shores of Lake Winnipeg, and on the hills above it, there are stone structures. Some of them are well documented, others are known only from local tradition. One of the more intriguing accounts comes from a 19th-century antiquarian named Ias Nason, who described a site on a hill above the lake's western shore, where a circle of large standing stones had been observed by early European settlers. Nason's account was published in 1876 in a local historical society journal, and then largely forgotten. In the 20th century, a researcher following up on Nason's account visited the general area and found not the circle of standing stones that Nason described, but a series of large stones arranged in a line running roughly north to south along a ridge crest, with one stone at the northern end that was significantly taller than the others and that appeared to have been worked, its upper surface smoothed and flattened in a way that suggested intentional modification. Whether this is the same site that Nason described, and whether the circle of standing stones he reported had been partially disturbed in the intervening century, is unknown. The site was not formally documented. The researcher who visited it published a brief account in a now obscure journal, and the tall worked stone on the ridge above Lake Winnipesaukee stands where it has always stood in the forest, its significance and its origin as mysterious as ever. The solstice traditions of the pre-Columbian eastern United States have been documented in the ethnographic literature with enough detail to give us a sense of how the astronomical awareness embedded in the stone structures would have been expressed in living ceremonial practice. The Cherokee green corn ceremony, known as Salu Ulisui, the ceremony of the Corn Mother, was the most important ceremonial event of the Cherokee year. It was timed to the first full moon after the summer solstice, and involved a purification of the community, a renewal of the sacred fire, a celebration of the new corn harvest, and a series of dances and ritual performances that re-establish the proper relationships between the human community and the spiritual powers that govern the natural world. The timing of the ceremony to the first full moon after the summer solstice means that Cherokee ceremonial leaders had to track both the solar calendar to identify the solstice and the lunar calendar to identify the appropriate full moon. This dual tracking of solar and lunar cycles is precisely the kind of astronomical sophistication that the construction of solstice-aligned chambers and lunar standstill-aligned earthworks implies. The green corn ceremony was not unique to the Cherokee. Versions of it were practiced by indigenous peoples throughout the southeastern United States, including the Creek, the Choctaw, the Choctaw, and others. Its widespread distribution suggests an ancient origin predating the differentiation of the southeastern cultural groups into the distinct peoples that European explorers encountered. The ceremony carried a common astronomical framework across an enormous cultural area, a framework that had to have originated in a period when the cultures of that area were more closely connected than they were at the time of European contact. The stone structures that predate all of these historically known cultures may have been built within, or may have helped to establish an ancestral version of that astronomical framework. The same attention to solstice timing, the same integration of solar and lunar observation, the same understanding of the year as a cycle of specific significant moments to be marked and honored runs through the archaeological evidence of the stone structures and the ethnographic evidence of the historical ceremonial traditions. This continuity does not require unbroken cultural transmission from the stone builders to the historically documented cultures. It may represent the persistence of a very deep and very widespread human understanding of time and season, an understanding that expressed itself differently in different cultural contexts, but drew on a common bedrock of observational knowledge about the sky. The wind is changing. It often does here in the mountains, in the late night hours, when the temperature inversions of the valley are disrupted by the cooling of the high country. The new wind comes from the northwest, carrying with it the smell of rain that has fallen somewhere over the ridges to the west, a cold rain smell that mixes with the old leaves and the stone and the faint trace of the spring below. The stone chamber in the hollow does not notice the wind. It has not noticed anything in the centuries since it was built. It simply stands, its mass indifferent to weather, its stones fitting together in their patient arrangement, its entrance waiting for the dawn that will come, and for the solstice dawn that will come in 12 days, as it has come every year for as long as the chamber has existed. There is a comfort in that, in the permanence of stone, in the fact that some things are built to last, and that they do last, outlasting the intentions of their builders, outlasting the cultures that created them, outlasting even the memory of what they were for. The comfort is not the comfort of certainty. The mystery of these structures is real, and it may never be fully resolved, but it is the comfort of continuity. The sense that the human relationship with this landscape, with these specific hills and hollows and ridge crests and springs, is very old, that the landscape has been known, loved, marked, and honored by human beings for far longer than our ordinary history acknowledges, that we are not the first to stand here in the darkness and feel the weight of these mountains. That weight is a kind of company, the company of the dead, the company of all the people who have stood in these specific places across the long span of time, since the first person came to this mountain country and found it worth inhabiting. Their presence is not supernatural. It is simply the fact that they were here, and they built things, and those things are still here. And standing near them connects you, however tenuously, to the chain of human presence that the buildings represent. That chain is the real subject of the Appalachian megalithic mystery, not the specific identity of the builders, not the specific provenance of the architectural tradition, not the specific meaning of the astronomical alignments. Important as all of those questions are, the real subject is the human need to build, to mark, to make permanent, to extend the self beyond the individual life, into the landscape and the time that surrounds it. The builders of these chambers and walls and cairns had that need. They expressed it in stone, and the stone has held it faithfully for all the years since. Sleep comes to the mountains the way it comes to all old places. Slowly, gradually, the sounds that mark activity, settling into the sounds that mark rest. The last birds falling silent, the insects finding their chorus and holding it as the temperature drops. The water in the creeks, finding its night rhythm, which is no different from its day rhythm, but sounds different in the dark. The great horned owl that has been calling from somewhere on the ridge to the north calls again. Once, then silence for a long time, then again from a different position, moving through the canopy in the methodical way that owls move when they are hunting. The owl does not know about stone chambers or ancient mysteries. It knows about mice in the leaf litter, and the positions of the trees, and the patterns of light and shadow that its remarkable eyes process into a map of the world. It is solving the problem of its own existence in the way the owls have solved it for millions of years, by hunting the dark with extraordinary senses and patience and the ability to move almost silently through the air. The ancient people who built in these mountains knew this owl or owls like it. They knew its calls and what those calls meant. They probably had stories about it, as humans have had stories about owls in virtually every culture that has lived near them. They understood the owl's nightly movements through the forest as part of the larger pattern of the living world, a pattern that the stone structures were designed to honor and engage with. That engagement, that understanding of human life as embedded in a larger living pattern, rather than separate from it, is perhaps the deepest thing that the Appalachian stone structures represent. Not technological sophistication, though they show that, not astronomical knowledge, though they demonstrate that, but an orientation toward the world, a way of being in the landscape that understood the human community as one participant among many, in a world that was fully and complexly alive. We have largely lost that orientation. We live in a world that we understand ourselves to stand outside of and above, managing and manipulating it according to our needs. The consequences of that orientation are becoming increasingly apparent. The stone chambers of the Appalachians are not a solution to the problems of modernity. They are not a blueprint for how we should live, but they are a reminder that the orientation we now take as natural and inevitable is actually a recent and possibly temporary departure from a much older understanding of what it means to be human in a living world. That reminder is worth something. It is worth going into the mountains to find. It is worth sitting within the dark, letting it settle into the places in the mind that are not reached by analysis or argument, the places that are reached only by stories told slowly in the night. The last thing to say about the Appalachian megalithic mystery is also the first thing. The mountains are real. The stones are real. The questions are real. Everything else, the interpretations, the theories, the speculations about origins and connections and meanings, is provisional. It is the best current thinking of people who have engaged seriously with limited evidence. It will be revised as new evidence emerges, and as the investigation, which has barely begun, continues. But the mystery itself is not provisional. The stone chambers exist. The astronomical alignments are real. The walls run through the forest. The cans stand on the ridge crests. The petroglyphs carry their unknown messages on their silent boulders. The springs run beside their ancient chambered hillsides. The mystery is the permanent thing. It will outlast any specific answer that is offered for it, because the answers are always partial, always provisional, always subject to revision. What does not change is the fact of the unknown, the fact of the stones standing in the forest with their unanswered questions intact. Living with the unknown is a skill. It is perhaps the fundamental skill that the Appalachian stone structures teach us, if we let them. The skill of standing in the presence of something genuinely mysterious and staying with it, not rushing to fill the mystery with an explanation, but allowing the mystery to be what it is, which is to say, the honest acknowledgement that the world is larger and older and stranger than our current knowledge can account for. The mountains have always known this. They have been here long enough to have watched many kinds of knowing come and go. The knowing of the people who built the chambers, the knowing of the people who came after and forgot what the chambers were for but kept the memory of their significance. The knowing of the European settlers who looked at the chambers and saw root cellars, or the work of Indians, or nothing of note. The knowing of the researchers who have spent decades walking these hills trying to understand what they hold. All of these kinds of knowing are partial. None of them is the whole truth. The mountains hold the whole truth in the way that ancient stone holds things silently and without interpretation, available to whoever is patient enough and humble enough to approach, with genuine questions and genuine openness. Come with questions. Come with patience. Come in the dark, when the ordinary noise of the world has settled, and you can hear the wind in the old trees, and the water in the old creeks, and the silence that is not the absence of sound, but the Indian added, "Come and listen." The mountains are speaking in the only language they know, in stone, in time, in the patience of things that have learned to wait. There is one more place I want to take you before this night ends. It is not a famous site. It does not appear in any book about American mysteries or alternative archaeology. It does not have a name that anyone outside of a very small radius would recognize. It is simply a hillside in the southern Appalachian, a hillside that rises steeply from a narrow creek valley, and that is covered like all the surrounding hillsides in a dense, second growth forest of tulip poplar and red oak, and sourwood, and mountain laurel. The hillside has a spring on it, about 2/3 of the way up from the creek. The spring emerges from the base of a large quartzite outcropping, the water seeping out through a crack in the rock, and collecting in a small pool before running down the slope in a tiny rivulet that eventually reaches the creek below. The water is cold and clear. It has probably been running from that crack in that rock for thousands of years. Springs like this one are among the most stable features of the Appalachian landscape, persisting through the long cycles of forest growth and disturbance and regrowth that have characterized the post-glacial period. Just above the spring, tucked against the base of the quartzite outcropping, there is a structure. It is not large. It consists of 4 flat stones, 2 upright slabs forming the sides of a narrow entrance, a large capstone laid across the top, and behind these, 2 more upright slabs enclosing a small interior space, perhaps 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep. The floor of the interior is level, slightly concave, as if it has been scooped or worn smooth. The stones are fitted together without mortar, their surfaces in close contact, the weight of the capstone stabilizing the uprights. The structure faces downs slope toward the southeast. On the mornings of the spring and fall equinoxes, the rising sun enters the entrance of the structure and illuminates the back wall. Nobody built this structure last year, or last decade, or last century. The quartzite surfaces show weathering consistent with many decades of exposure, at minimum. The lichen colonies are old. The soil that has accumulated inside the structure beneath the leaf litter that fills it now would take decades to accumulate to the depth it has reached. The creek valley below has been farmed in living memory, but the steep hillside above the spring has probably never been farmed. The land is too steep and the soil too thin. It has been used for timber cut and recut over the past century and a half, but the cutting did not disturb the stone structure. It is still here. No researcher has formally documented this structure. The farmer who owns the land knows it is there and calls it the old rock hut, assuming without strong reason that it is some kind of old shelter built by early settlers. He has never investigated it further and has no particular curiosity about it. It sits on his property, which he uses for hunting and timber, and it is simply a feature of the landscape that he knows is there. I am telling you about this specific site, not because it is the most important or dramatic site in the Appalachians. It is not, but because it represents something important about the nature of this mystery. Most of the evidence for the Appalachian megalithic tradition is not in dramatic, well-documented sites like Mystery Hill or Upton. It is in small, unnamed, undocumented structures like the one above the spring on this unnamed hillside. It is in the accumulated anecdotal knowledge of landowners and hunters and farmers who know something unusual is on their property, but have never had reason to investigate further. It is in the oral traditions of communities who know that certain places are old and significant, but have not published that knowledge in any form that academic researchers would recognize. The mystery is everywhere in the mountains, not concentrated in a few dramatic locations, but distributed across the entire landscape, tucked into hollows and pressed against outcroppings, and positioned on ridge crests from Alabama to Quebec. It is in every spring with an old stone structure beside it. It is in every ridgeline wall that runs further than any colonial farmer would have had reason to build. It is in every cairn that stands on a summit with a view of other cans on other summits miles away. It is everywhere, and most of it has never been looked at carefully. The discipline of archaeology was established in the 19th century, primarily in Europe, by scholars who were interested in the ancient civilizations of the Old World. Its methods were developed in the context of sites in Greece and Italy, and Egypt and Mesopotamia, places where the relationship between the physical remains and the historical and literary records was close enough to allow interpretive frameworks to be built and tested against each record. And when those methods were applied to the Americas, they carried with them assumptions derived from the Old World context that did not always fit the New World evidence. The assumption that civilized, historically significant cultures were urban and literate was one of the most damaging of these transferred assumptions. In the Old World, the great ancient civilizations had cities and writing. In the Americas, the politically significant cultures of the post-Cont period, the ones that European explorers and colonists needed to understand and negotiate with, were often not urban and not literate in the European sense. The conclusion, too quickly drawn and too long maintained, was that pre-Columbian North America did not have civilized cultures worth serious archaeological investigation. This conclusion has been progressively revised by the evidence. The recognition of the Hopewell tradition in the mid-9th century showed that complex cultures with long-distance trade networks existed in pre-Columbian eastern North America. The identification and dating of Cahokia showed that urban settlement on a significant scale was possible in pre-Columbian North America. The decipherment of Maya writing showed that at least one American civilization had a fully developed writing system. The genetic and archaeological evidence of Viking settlement in Newfoundland showed that transoceanic contact before Columbus was a historical fact, not a fantasy. Each of these revisions required overcoming significant institutional resistance. Each of them was initially dismissed by the dominant scholarly consensus and only gradually accepted as the evidence became impossible to ignore. The pattern suggests that the next revision, whatever it turns out to be, will follow the same path. The Appalachian megalithic tradition may be that next revision, or it may be part of a larger revision that encompasses several related questions simultaneously. The full extent of pre-Columbian cultural complexity in eastern North America, the possible existence of transatlantic contacts before the Viking period, the age and sophistication of astronomical and architectural knowledge in pre-Columbian North America. These questions are connected, and resolving any one of them will likely illuminate the others. The stones in the mountains are waiting for that resolution. They will wait as long as necessary. It is very late now. The night has deepened past the point where the hours seem to matter, into that territory beyond midnight, where time moves differently, and the distance between sleeping and waking becomes permeable. The owl has stopped calling. The wind has settled. The creek below the hill is the only sound. Its quiet persistence, a kind of ground note beneath the silence of the rest of the world. The stone chamber at the base of the quartzite outcropping is dark and still. The spring beside it is running. The stars above the ridge, the same stars that were above this ridge when the first human being stood here and understood this place as significant, are turning in their slow circles, the constellations moving imperceptibly from east to west as the earth turns beneath them. At the center of everything, at the still point around which all of this turns, there is a question, not a dramatic question, not a question with an obvious answer waiting to be revealed. A quiet question. The kind of question that sits with you in the dark and does not demand an answer, but simply asks to be held. Who was here before us? What did they understand that we have forgotten? What did they build? And why? And where has that building led? These questions do not have simple answers. They probably never will. The evidence is too fragmentary, the time too deep, the cultural context too far removed from anything we can fully reconstruct. But the questions themselves are worth holding. They are worth lying here with, in the dark, feeling their weight, letting them do what questions do when you stop trying to answer them immediately and simply stay with them. They open something. They create a space in which the world becomes a little larger, a little more mysterious, a little more worth paying attention to. And that space, that opening into mystery and attention, and the awareness that the world is more than our current knowledge accounts for, that is perhaps what the stone chambers were built to create. A space where the ordinary categories of experience expand, where time loses its ordinary quality of pressure and urgency, where the individual human life is felt briefly and clearly as one moment in a much larger story. We are all tonight inside that space. Whatever questions the Appalachian Mountains hold in their ancient stone, those questions are available to us in the dark. Available not as answers, but as invitations. Invitations to wonder, to attend, to remain curious about the long human story on this continent and on this planet. The story is longer than we know. It is stranger than we expect. It is more beautiful, and more mysterious, and more worthy of our attention than any single version of it can contain. The mountains know this. They have always known this. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world is most still and most honest, they are willing to share it with anyone who is willing to be still enough to listen. Sleep well, dream of old stone and older stars, and the long river of human time flowing through these mountains. Dream of the people who stood where you might stand, who looked up at what you can see, who built something to mark what they understood about the turning of the world. They are not gone. They are in the stone. They are in the question. They are in the night. There is a word in the Cherokee language, Elohare, that is often translated as nature or the natural world. But that translation loses most of what the word actually means. Elohare is closer to something like the whole living context of existence, the totality of relationships between all beings and all places and all times. It includes the human and the non-human, the living and the dead, the visible and the invisible, the present and the past, and whatever comes after. It is not a backdrop to human life. It is the medium in which human life occurs, inseparable from it, constitutive of it. When the Cherokees speak of their relationship to the southern Appalachian, they are speaking about their relationship to Elohe. The mountains are not simply their homeland in the political sense, they are the specific form that the whole living context of existence takes in this part of the world. The ridges and hollows and creeks and springs and stone outcroppings are nodes in the web of relationships that constitute Aloha, each one with its own character and history and significance, each one connected to all the others in ways that are not always visible but are always real. The stone structures of the Appalachian, seen through this conceptual framework, are not merely human constructions. They are nodes in the Elo web where human intention and natural stone and astronomical light and flowing water converge in a particularly powerful way. Places where many threads of relationship come together. Places where the density of connection between human beings and the rest of the living world is unusually high, and where entering that density of connection can change something in a person who is open to being changed. This is not a Western scientific description. It is not translatable directly into the categories of archaeology or astronomy or architecture, but it is a description of what these places are from within a conceptual tradition that has thought about them carefully for a very long time, and it is at least as worthy of consideration as any description that Western scientific categories can produce. The stone chambers and walls and cairns of the Appalachians are from within the framework of Elohare exactly what they appear to be. They are places where human beings, understanding themselves as participants in a living world rather than observers of an inert one, made permanent the relationships that gave their lives meaning. They built them so that the relationships would persist, even after the individuals who created them were gone, so that the spring would still have its stone beside it, so that the sunrise of the solstice would still have its chamber to enter, so that the ridgeline would still have its cairns to mark the sightlines between the high places. The relationships persist. The chamber still receives the solstice light. The spring still runs beside the stones. The cairns still stand on the ridge crests, still visible to each other across the miles of valley and forest between them. The people who built these things are gone from the visible world. But from within the framework of Elohara, they are not entirely gone. They are present in the relationships they created, which are still real, still active, still doing what they were built to do. The relationship between the chamber and the solstice sunrise, the relationship between the standing stone and the lunar standstill, the relationship between the cairn and the distant cairn that it speaks to across the ridge. These relationships are the builder's persistence in the world. They are what survives, and they are perhaps more durable than any monument in stone because they are not merely physical. They are the persistence of intention in a world where intention, if it is embedded deeply enough in the structure of things, can outlast the individual lives that gave rise to it by any amount of time. The intention was to mark the turning of the world, to acknowledge the cycles, to stand at the threshold moments and be present in a way that honored what those moments meant. That intention is still here in the stone, in the alignment, in the question, in the night that holds all of this patiently, without judgment, without urgency, in the same way that the mountains hold what they hold, which is everything, which is enough. If you have stayed with this story to this point, you have done something rare. You have held an open question for a long time, without demanding that it close. You have walked through a great deal of darkness and uncertainty, metaphorical darkness, and the literal darkness of the night in which you are listening, and you have arrived here at this quiet place near the end. The question of who built the stone structures of the Appalachian Mountains will not be answered tonight. It may not be answered in our lifetime. It may be answered incompletely and provisionally by researchers working decades from now, with tools and methods that do not yet exist. Or it may remain, as it has remained for all the time that anyone has been curious enough to ask, a genuine mystery in the oldest sense of that word. Not a puzzle waiting for a solution, but an invitation to the kind of awareness that mystery calls forth. The awareness that knows itself to be standing at the edge of what is known, looking out into the vast territory of what is not yet understood, and finding that edge not frightening, but deeply, genuinely alive. The Appalachians have been holding this mystery for a very long time. They are good at holding things. Mountains are. So are you tonight. So is this darkness. So is the slow turning of the world that the stone chambers were built to mark and honor. The world is still turning. The sun will rise again. And somewhere in the Appalachian forest, the entrance of a stone chamber is already positioned to receive that rising on the morning when the sun reaches its winter extreme and begins its slow return toward warmth. That is not nothing. That is in the deepest sense everything. Sleep now. And if you wake in the night, as people have always woken in the long middle hours, take a moment before you reach for the light. Lie in the dark for just a breath or two. Let the room be a hollow in the earth. Let the ceiling be old stone. Let the window be an entrance that faces the cold northeastern sky, waiting for the light that comes once a year to find its way down the long passage, and mark the turning of the world on the back wall, where the ancestor put their hand and pressed their mark. You are part of that chain. You are one more person lying in the dark in the mountains of the world, in the long darkness before the light returns. The builders of the chambers knew this night too, knew what it was to wait in the dark for the sun to come back, knew the weight of the longest night, knew the extraordinary ordinary fact of the morning returning. It always returns. It has always returned. That is the oldest fact. The fact before all other facts. Older than stone. Older than the mountains that hold the stone. The light returns. After every darkness, however long and however deep, the light returns. The people who built their chambers to receive that returning light understood this in their bones and in their blood. And in the generations of lived experience that produced their tradition, they did not take the returning light for granted. They built in stone to honor it. They gathered, presumably in their chambers in the deep of winter, and watched it come back. Watched the first thread of solstice light enter the passage, and traveled to the back wall. And they felt presumably what human beings always feel when the thing they feared might not. Return does return. Relief so deep it becomes gratitude. Gratitude so deep it becomes reverence. Reverence so deep it becomes in the end stone. That is what these mountains hold. Not just the mystery of who built what and when and why, but the deeper mystery of why human beings, in every era and every culture, reach for permanence when they want to honor what matters most. Why the impulse to build, to mark, to make lasting is so deep and so universal that it cannot be attributed to any single tradition or any single people. It is the human impulse itself. It is what we do when we are paying attention to what is actually important. The builders of the Appalachian chambers were paying attention. They left the evidence of their attention in stone. The stone is still there, and the light still comes. If you're here to relax or drift off to sleep, then you're exactly where you're meant to be. That's why I create these videos. If you enjoy calm journeys through history, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. Good night.